Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became a royal candidate part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗵𝗃 from AO3. So let's start the video. From an early age, Midoriya Izuku had wanted to go on an adventure, explore the world, meet new people, fall in love, save people in need. At the age of 19, he got his wish. He had started his adventure a couple of days ago, the day the letter arrived. Only he didn't quite felt like the hero his village made him out to be. He felt more like the maiden in need. Well, to be exact, he currently was a maiden, not a maiden in need. The most dangerous thing he had encountered on his journey were hungry goats, who thought the carriage would suffice as food. Izuku could hardly blame them. The carriage looked expensive, like, really expensive. He probably could feed his entire village for a year if he could sell this carriage, horses included, without being ripped off, of course. The coachman was free to go. Staring out the window, Izuku longed back to the goats who tried to eat one of the wheels. They were at least familiar. He had seen plenty of animals in his life back home, living between the farms and woods. But now there wasn't an animal in sight, aside from the rare bird here and there. In the distance, the palace loomed. The palace belonged to the Todoroki family, who have been the rulers over this kingdom for centuries. Izuku had dreamed of seeing the palace once in his lifetime, as a knight. Maybe he would serve the king a few years before traveling on his own. But now, he would go to the palace disguised as a woman, his cousin Midoriya Izuku specifically. The letter that arrived little more than a week ago announced that his cousin was one of the women selected for the competition. The official name was the Crown's Game, but with the bloody origin that came with the name, Izuku preferred to just call it the competition. Centuries ago, knights battled for the hand of the crown princess, only one of the 24 competitors living to tell the tale. Nowadays, it was a competition to find the crown prince a wife. 24 women were selected to take part in the competition to win the prince's affection and possibly win the crown. The women were randomly selected and not given an option to back out, unless for medical reasons. The reason he went in his cousin's stead, who was perfectly female, was because she was already engaged to her childhood sweetheart. In spring, less than 4 months away, the snow and frost would make way for dew and poppies, and his cousin would have her spring marriage. It was a small sacrifice to make, going in her stead. After all he had to do was show up, fail the first test and be sent home. After all, only one person could win the whole thing. And even if he lasted longer than the first test, he would get something out of it. An adventure, unlike anything he expected. There are no weapons, armors, fights to the dead and people to save. Instead, there would be 23 other women, dresses, gossip, friendships, rivalries, one mysterious prince and an epic romance that would go into the history books. The palace was beyond anything Izuku could have imagined. It was enormous, bigger than all the houses in his village combined. The grounds were flocked with knights. Some were guarding the doors, but most of them were loitering around. The garden was quite empty, its trees losing leaves, most of the plants no longer in bloom. Izuku imagined it would look absolutely stunning during spring and summertime. "Your name, miss." Izuku almost jumped, hurriedly tearing his gaze away from the garden to the gatekeeper. He had forgotten all about the gatekeeper, who had been talking to another knight during Izuku's arrival. The knight looked grumpy, which made Izuku assume that the question has been repeated, or it was his default facial feature. Nonetheless, this was a wonderful first impression. Midoriya Izuku. The name felt foreign on his tongue. The guard raised an eyebrow at his squeaky voice but probably wrote it off as just nerves as he looked through his papers. He had opted to just use his regular voice, soft enough to pass as feminine. He could try differently, but that would be hard to keep up. He wasn't a born actor, and as he would be surrounded by people for the majority of his time, he would slip up at some point. "Welcome to the palace," the guard said, his voice flat and droning. He must have rehearsed these words. "From this moment, you're part of the competition. Inside, the staff will be waiting for your arrival and will bring you to your room. Have a lovely stay, Lady Midoriya." Izuku bowed, picking up his second bag. The other he was carrying on his back. He cut straight through the garden, not bothering to follow the long winding path. There would be another day for exploring, but right now he had other priorities, like getting out these shoes. Despite being muscular from the hours doing heavy labor, Izuku looked like a pretty convincing female. His hair, which usually was kept together with a clothes strap, now hung free. The curls brushed past his shoulder. They also occasionally poked him in the eye. But that was the price of beauty. The dress he wore was tailored to him, and the people must have sacrificed half their fortune to make him look half decent. The green matched his eyes and hair, and the cut was wonderful. Nice waist, an illusion of a chest, and his arms didn't look like he actually did spend hours cutting wood and doing the heavy lifting. The dress was also pretty warm, despite the time of the year. The heels were an overkill though. He wasn't that short, and walking on them was disastrous. But Haruka had advised him to make a good, first impression. Next time, he would ignore her advice and wear boots. It was a struggle to walk in heels. Izuku didn't want to throw out his arms to balance himself. He wasn't going to sink that low yet, but he was tempted. However, despite wanting to be sent home as quickly as possible, he rather didn't want to leave a stain on his, or his village's, reputation. Being in the bad graces with the royal family wasn't particularly favorable. In the end, he should have gone with the balancing plan. Maybe some guards would have sniggered at him, but that would have been the worst of it. Now he saw the world flashing by as he lost his balance, one of his heels sinking into the dirt. Boots. Next time, he would go with boots. In a fairy tale, a dazzling guy would have scooped him up in his arms, asking a charming "Are you okay?" and they would get married months later. This wasn't a fairy tale. However, there was someone kind enough to come to his rescue. Before falling face first into the grass, someone wrapped their arms around his chest and tugged him upright. Unable to regain his balance once upright, he fell back against his rescuer. Apparently, they weren't expecting Izuku's weight, because seconds later they both fell backwards. Only the grass cushioned their fall, and Izuku's rescuer cushioned his fall. Now he felt bad for them. "I'm sorry," Izuku half shouted, crawling somewhere to get off his rescuer. His dress probably had sustained grass stains by now, which was going to be a pain to get washed. But it was fixable, and he couldn't just remain sitting on a person. "Are you okay?" His Prince Charming turned out to be Princess Charming. She was lying flat on the grass, taking wheezing breaths. Her bright red dress had flared out on the lawn, her shoes sticking out. She had been smart, currently wearing flats. Worried about the shallow breathing, Izuku feared he had caused her to double over. He crawled over to sit down next to the girl's face, meeting her gaze. Well, so far for worrying. Instead of wheezing in pain, trying to catch her breath, she was sobbing with laughter. Her hands had covered her mouth, muffling the wheezes and bursts of laughter. Her eyes were wet with tears. Izuku waited for her to regain her breath. Her face had grown red. Tear stains glistered on her cheek. She was pretty cute, with her rosy cheeks and shoulder-length brown hair. He was also glad he wasn't the only one with short hair, as he had been worrying about blending in. "I'm sorry," the brunette said, wiping away her tears. She giggled again. "You looked like a newborn foal. You have never worn heels before, have you?" Despite feeling awfully embarrassed, Izuku didn't mind the questions. She was at least honest and didn't try to sweet-talk him. "I haven't," Izuku admitted, making himself comfortable on the grass. "I was advised to go for dress to impress." The girl nodded. "You're pretty impressive," she said. She seemed nice, and Izuku doubted that she had some secret agenda he had been warned for. He had heard all about the horror stories that came with the competition and had been wary, but she seemed kind. "Not as impressive as you," Izuku said. "I'm pretty heavy, and you just hauled me back like I weighed nothing." The girl grinned, flexing her arms. "My parents do woodwork, furniture, structures, and toys. Someone has to help out." After getting rid of his heels, he wouldn't like a repeat of that. Izuku got up and offered the girl his hand. The girl was feather light, so pulling her up was pretty easy. She seemed surprised though, as surprise crossed her face. "You don't get hands like that from sitting at home and being pretty." She squeezed Izuku's hand. "Woodwork, woodcutting," Izuku admitted. "It gets pretty cold where I live." The girl stretched her arms, palms aimed towards the sky. "This is going to be awesome," she said, her eyes bright with joy. "Nice food, no work, good beds, and pretty girls." Izuku couldn't help but laugh. He offered his arm to the girl. "Midoriya Haruka," he introduced himself. "Uraraka Ochako." Uraraka linked her arm with his. They gathered their luggage soon after, realizing that they couldn't lounge all day in the garden, at least, not without confirming their presence. Uraraka had dropped her luggage when she had seen Izuku flailing, and Izuku had lost his second bag when he had started to flail. He was glad all the fragile items were in his second bag, and not his backpack, as he might have crushed them otherwise. Uraraka was the one who took the lead, dragging Izuku towards the palace. He was glad he had ditched his heels, and Uraraka was a bundle of energy. They got a few looks from the guards. He was sure that they either were captivated by Uraraka's cheer or the fact he was walking around on bare feet, carrying the heels with him. The inside of the castle was even more impressive than the outside. Awestruck, Izuku looked around the grand entrance. Instead of entering a corridor, they were greeted by a grand, open hall. The walls and floor were white, which was a stark contrast to the dark, wooden doors. There was one large staircase, tiled in marble just like the floor. He already imagined himself slipping on the stairs and cracking open his skull. Marble was pretty, but not practical. There were many large windows, causing the room to bask in natural light. "I feel poor," Uraraka said, voice filled with awe. "I can't imagine living here. I would get lost." Izuku nodded in agreement. It was really overwhelming and slightly suffocating. Who needed so much space anyway? He probably could house his village in here, easily. One of the dozen or so doors opened, and a sharply dressed guy entered the entrance hall. Izuku guessed he was in his early 30s. He had pale skin and black hair. He must be someone important, considering the expensive-looking clothes. Though, as he came closer to them, he looked less impressive and more tired. There was a stubble across his jaw, dark circles under his eyes, and he even yawned, though he was polite enough to hide it. The welcome committee the knight had promised. "Ladies," the man said, bowing curtly, "I'm in charge to make sure you're settled here. So please state your names so I can make sure you'll find your rooms." The man managed to summon a clipboard from thin air. Both Izuku and Uraraka introduced themselves, and the man crossed their names off. Only a handful of contestants are yet to arrive. The competition will start tomorrow. If, of course, everything goes according to schedule. Miss 𝗵𝗲 will escort you to your rooms. Food will be brought upstairs by our staff. Please don't leave your wing, which is technically just a hallway, without someone escorting you. You wouldn't be the first to get lost. Curfew is after 11. You're allowed to visit each other's room, though avoid fighting. The man yawned, rubbing his eyes. He must have been up and going for a while, Izuku thought, or he was just not in the mood for this. A woman, around the same age as the male in front of them, entered the room. She wore a deep purple dress and looked quite pretty. The way she walked oozed confidence, her heels clacking against the floor. "I will be escorting the two of you," she said, offering them a reassuring smile. As she glanced over the guy's shoulder to read the list, her smile grew wider. "Lady Uraraka and Lady Midoriya, if you will follow me." 𝗵𝗲, Izuku assumed she was 𝗵𝗲, walked towards the grand staircase. She was quite fast, faster than Izuku could ever walk on heels. Even barefooted, it was hard to keep up with her. Not that Uraraka was faring much better. She was a couple of inches shorter than him, and he wasn't the tallest among men or women. "Miss 𝗵𝗲," Uraraka asked, being the first one who managed to catch up, "do we get our own rooms, or are we bunking together?" Izuku was pretty sure that all color drained from his face. He had assumed that they would get a room each, but if that weren't the case, it would be an absolute pain. He didn't wear a wig, which made a huge difference, but it would be inappropriate to see a girl in a semi-dressed state, especially as the girl is unaware he is a guy. Also, he wouldn't be able to get changed in his bedroom. He had to use the bathroom and pray that they could be locked. Aizawa clearly hasn't mentioned it. 𝗵𝗲 climbed another set of stairs, sounded a little disappointed with her co-worker. "But you'll have your own room. One corridor is shared with 6 candidates. There are 2 bathrooms. Yamada and I have planned the sleeping arrangements in a way that would ease all the ladies into their temporary new lifestyle." "What does that mean?" Izuku asked, racking his brain to make sense. "That we are put together with people from the same background. Like Uraraka and me are both from a heavy labor-driven background. So would that mean we share the corridor and bathrooms?" 𝗵𝗲 clapped her hands together. "Exactly. We assumed that it would make the experience better when you're in the company of people you're familiar with. And rich people aren't stuck with the poor," Izuku added soberly. He had to admit he would be more comfortable with the likes of Uraraka, who knew what hard work was in barely getting by, but it was mostly to spare the rich from having to share their bathroom with some grubby commoners. "Bright one, aren't you, Lady Midoriya?" 𝗵𝗲 had sobered up quite a bit, which made Izuku a little happy. At least she wasn't trying to sell it. But yes, it had been a request from several parents, and the king insisted. Any of the cheer or excitement had disappeared from the 3 of them. Even 𝗵𝗲 had no longer had a bounce in her step. Despite advertising that the contest gave back to the commoners, in the past, easily half of the participants had some kind of title. Duchesses, baronesses, viscounts, dames. They were still part of society, and definitely not on the same level as the royal family, but there was still a large gap between them and the commoners who just managed to meet ends meet. Most of the time, if not always, they were the ones who ended up becoming the new queen. "Ladies," 𝗵𝗲 announced several flights of stairs and corridors later, stopping at the mouth of a rather small corridor. "We're here." The walls were painted a soft cream color. The floor was made of wood instead of marble, and there were 8 dark oak doors. The only window in sight was at the end of the hallway, letting the autumn sun stream into the palace. It was a dead end, which made Izuku slightly nervous. They would get trapped here if there was ever an attack. No way of fleeing. "Your rooms all have a nameplate on the door," 𝗵𝗲 said, gesturing to the door closest to them. 𝗳𝗪𝗄𝗄 it read. "Lunch will be brought up in a bit. Currently, only one of your fellow contestants has arrived. The rest will arrive later today. I assume Aizawa told you everything you need. And if not, ring the bell if there are any questions." Only now Izuku noticed the thin, golden cord hanging next to the window. He had mistaken it for a part of the curtains, but it clearly wasn't connected to anything, as it disappeared straight into the ground. When both of them nodded, 𝗵𝗲 left in a hurry. Izuku couldn't really blame her. The mood between them was almost dreadful. "Sorry for being such a killjoy," Izuku apologized. Uraraka sighed before she started to smile again. It looked as if she was pushing all the negativity in one sigh and moved on. "No, it's fine," she said, hauling her luggage to her room. It was next to Izuku's, which was next to 𝗬𝗪𝗀𝗧. I'm competitive. I'm planning on outlasting all the rich and then run away with the prince's choice of wife. Uraraka was letting out some kind of evil laugh, though it didn't sound all that mean-spirited. It sounded hilarious, and Izuku couldn't help but start laughing himself. Uraraka only managing to keep her evil cackling up for 10 seconds before starting to laugh, and Izuku joined her. They were making enough noise to attract the other contestant. One of the bedroom doors opened, and a girl almost launched herself into the hallway. Her face was bright with excitement. The first thing he noticed was the head full of wild, pink curls. They were like his bed head curls but artfully styled. She had brown skin, a broad smile, and she was around his height. Then he noticed she was only wearing a knee-length, deep blue nightgown, and Izuku hoped he wasn't either blushing or looked too awkward. Finally, she exclaimed, "I've been here for 2 days and no one. Where are you guys from? What are your names?" Both of them introduced themselves, and the girl introduced herself in return. Her name was 𝗓𝗍𝗄, preferred to be called Mina, and she was from a city up north. Izuku recognized the name, as it was the closest by city to his hometown. It was still 2 days traveling from his, but it was at least something in close vicinity. "Have you guys any idea what the prince looks like?" Mina asked. They had settled themselves in Mina's room, as it was the only place that was remotely lived in. Izuku's room currently only had a bed, nightstand, wardrobe, desk, and chair. There were no paintings, no knickknacks, nothing to make it personal. Mina's looked like she had lived in there for years, with pictures, letters from her family, jewelry boxes, hair accessories, food, and much more all strewn around the room. A redhead like his father, maybe, Uraraka mused. She was brushing out the tangles in her hair. "Handsome, maybe." Izuku let out a choked-off laugh. "Depends on who he got his looks." It felt weird, gossiping about the royal family. On the other hand, these people still felt like a fairy tale to him. People who only existed trough stories and whispers. The queen, he had been told, was stunning, and the king once had looked handsome. But unlike his wife, he hadn't aged that gracefully. "I hope he's at least nice," Uraraka said wistfully. "I want to stay here for a while, and I can only fake it for so much." Mina giggled and nodded in agreement. "This place is awesome. It's like a free holiday. Good food, nice people, no duties, and hopefully seeing some handsome men." "Have you seen some of the guards?" Izuku shook his head. "We only met a guy named Aizawa and lady named Kayama, who are both parts of the royal staff, looking at their clothes and their knowledge of the competition." "Pity," Mina said, popping a sweet in her mouth. "I've seen some good-looking guards walking around. Aren't we supposed to stay here, in this wing?" The hallway could barely be called a wing. Admittedly, the bedroom was bigger than Izuku's living and dining room combined, but he had seen some of the other rooms. "No way, I stayed put in this room for days on end," Mina said, lying down in a crooked starfish position. Her leg was bent to accommodate Uraraka, who shared the bed space. "And what if you get caught? Won't you get in trouble?" Mina laughed and shook her head. "How many of us do you think are here to actually compete for the crown? I'm not, are you too? I don't want to marry a guy." "I do," Izuku chimed in, only seconds later realizing what he said. Embarrassment flooded his body, his face growing red. Izuku was hit by the feeling as if he had been watched. He moved his gaze from his lap, a very safe place to look at, to Mina, who was eyeing him. There was a twinkle of mischief in her eyes, and her grin reminded him of a cat. She had given up her sprawl. Now she was lying on her belly, head propped up on her elbows and hands. "So, you're interested in the prince?" Was he? Not necessarily. Like Uraraka, he wasn't here because he wanted to marry the prince. He was here because of his duty, and he didn't even know the prince. Uraraka straight up cooed, tugging Izuku's arm in enthusiasm. "That's so sweet. You're actually interested in the prince." "I'm not." Izuku didn't sound convincing. "It's just, I live in such a small community that I never had the chance to really court someone." "So you've never kissed a boy?" Mina asked. Izuku shook his head. "I finally have a purpose here," Mina cried, jumping up. She now was towering over them. "By the end of this contest, you will have smooched a guy." Izuku protested. Uraraka tried to protest for him, but Mina seemed to be dead set on it. Then there was a hesitant knock on the door. "Come in," Mina shouted. This was totally different from the quietness of his hometown. Well, there were always kids running outside screaming, and there were still people to talk with. But people generally kept to themselves. And as the girls had gotten older, most of them didn't want to have anything to do with boys. Contestant number 4 had arrived. She had long dark hair with tight curls, dark brown skin, and a sweet smile. It took him a few seconds to realize she wasn't wearing a dress, but a shorter, long-sleeved top in white and a sunny yellow skirt. "I'm 𝗬𝗪𝗃𝗃, she introduced herself, a little quiet. Mina jumped off her bed, hurrying over to 𝗬𝗪𝗃𝗃. "Ashido Mina," she introduced herself, shaking the girl's hand. "But call me Mina." 𝗬𝗪𝗃𝗃 looked a little startled. Mina was a bit overwhelming. "Aren't we competitors?" 𝗬𝗪𝗃𝗃 asked, hesitantly shaking Mina's hand. "Well, Midoriya wants to smooch the prince." "I do not." Izuku's face felt like it was on fire. I only said I never kissed a guy before. Mina continued as if Izuku hadn't said anything. I used the opportunity to have a holiday. And uraraka is here for the competitors. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 knitted her eyebrows in confusion. So you're here for the prince? She asked uraraka directly. No, I'm here for the girls. An O came from 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁. Then her shoulders slumped in relief. Okay, that makes things easier. I didn't come here for the prince either, but I met this cute guard that had to escort me to my room. Instead of rising at crack-ass of dawn, which was Izuku's normal time to rise, a maid woke him up around 8 with a breakfast tray. Breakfast in bed is something he had never experienced before, and he wasn't sure if he could get used to it. It was rather lonely. Well, it was lonely until uraraka barged into his bedroom and plopped down on his bed, her own breakfast tray still untouched. I never eat alone, uraraka admitted as she played with her food. It feels weird, picking at his own food. Izuku nodded in agreement. He always ate breakfast with his mother, and something with his cousin's family, but alone. Rarely, and that's when his mother either had to start early, or he started way later. Their breakfast was filled with chatter, uraraka telling him about this weird dream she had, about flying sheep who ate tiny dragons. It was truly an odd dream, but the way uraraka told it made it fascinating, and great to listen to. However, the ease that hung around them shattered when a maid came in to collect their trays. The way she looked at them with disappointment put a damper on Izuku's mood. It was clear that they didn't approve that the candidates bonded. It wasn't about them, it was about the prince. She announced that they had 30 minutes to get ready. After that, they would leave for the library for the introductions. I will see you later, okay, uraraka said, squeezing Izuku's wrist briefly before heading to her own room to get ready. Not in the mood to take a bath. Not that was time to take any. He just propped himself in front of the mirror his room supplied and tried to fix his hair. It took a while for his curls to look properly, but they still didn't reach the level of artfully tousled like Mina's hair. As for the dress, he selected a deep green from the small collection he brought along. He preferred trousers and a tunic, but he doubted that this would be appreciated. Additionally, he wasn't sure he could pass as a girl in men's clothing. The dress was quite different from the previous one he wore. The sleeves stopped at his elbows, exposing his lower arm. The freckles and tan were fine, but he felt slightly insecure about the scars. That happened when you cut wood in your short sleeves, or accidentally cut yourself with a sword. But the dress flowed more freely and felt a bit more breathable. The fabric brushed just past his knees, showing off his equally tanned, freckled and scarred legs, throwing on a pair of flats. He was going to burn those heels. Izuku left the room with time to spare. The corridor was mercifully quiet. For 5 seconds, it was just him and someone from the staff. The maid probably had to escort them downstairs. Then there came cursing from the bathroom. Feeling obligated to at least worry, since they were his friends for the duration of this contest, he knocked on the bathroom door. Are you okay? He asked kindly. No, uraraka's voice was filled with frustration. My hair is a mess. Can I come in? When he got the go-ahead of uraraka, he entered the bathroom. Uraraka was furiously brushing her hair, trying to get her hair straight again. She probably had tried to curl it, but that was hard to do in such a short amount of time. He was getting flashbacks to Natsuko's wedding, where he was the one who ended up fixing Natsuko's hair. Due to the heat, her hair had decided to grow life on its own. Everyone had been too busy with the preparations to come to Natsuko's. He spent too much of his childhood braiding the girl's hair. He had tried to salvage Natsuko's hair. He pried the hairbrush from uraraka's fingers, wetted it and started to brush out her attempted curls. It took about 5 minutes to wet uraraka's hair, braid it and decorate it. Her hair was parted in 2 braids, both interwoven with small, faux flowers from uraraka's accessories box. What do you think? Izuku asked nervously. The whole time, uraraka had her hands in front of her face. She hadn't been crying, thankfully, but she had been panicky. They all knew that you at least had to look the part of the competition, convince people that you cared about the prince, and then your family and village was safe from having a bad reputation. Carefully, as if having all the time in the world, she spread her fingers to get a glance at her hair. It looks. She touched the braids. Wow, she said, sounding amazed. It looks pretty. Izuku sagged with relief. It had been a while since he had done someone's hair. Guys, Mina's voice rang as a warning. We're leaving soon, you better hurry. Assuming soon was get your ass over here, or you will be left behind. Izuku helped uraraka pack her stuff and left the bathroom. The corridor was already bustling with life. While uraraka made a mad dash for her bedroom to put her things away, Izuku took in the rest of the girls he shared his hallway with. He stood out, not in height or how wild his curls were, but his dress screamed for attention. Mina had opted for a light blue dress with a high collar, a slim fit and bare arms. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 had a dress cut similarly to Izuku's, only was the color a soft yellow. He recalled uraraka's dress was a light pink. The other 2 girls, who must have arrived past curfew, were wearing muted colors, one beige and the other a reddish pink. all pastel colors, and here he was in a deep green number. Midoriya, Mina said chipper, inspecting him from head to toe with a quick glance. You have no idea how to style curls, do you? She wasn't cruel about it, just stating it. Flushing red, he started to tug on a few curls, trying to rearrange the mess. He never had bothered before, and in the short time frame he had to prepare himself before he left the village, he hadn't bothered to ask about styling curls. Finding clothes was more critical, as his closet wasn't actually filled with dresses. The maid announced they would head down to the library when uraraka returned to the hallway. Izuku had yet to respond to Mina's question, though he supposed that the opportunity would arise when they arrived in the library. He didn't need to wait for the library, as Mina took matters in her own hands. Leaving 𝗳𝗂𝗁𝗲 behind, uraraka immediately took Mina's spot. Mina caught up with him. For a dress so form-fitting, she could walk surprisingly well. I could teach you, Mina offered, gripping Izuku's arm for balance. Looking down, Izuku saw that she was wearing a pair of pretty tall heels. Tonight, the only reason I know is that my family is in the industry, making clothes, cutting hair, dyeing hair. He vaguely recalled Mina telling him about her family, but they purposely had foregone talking an awful lot about their home life, as it made them just sad. They all missed their family to some degree, though Izuku knew his mother was worse off than him. Now she was all alone, while he still had all these girls he could befriend. You would do that? Izuku glanced at the pair of girls behind them. They looked bored, but there was a sharp look in their eyes. It seemed that they were here to win this thing. This is a competition. Mina raised an eyebrow. So, that doesn't mean I don't care about others. It would be awfully lonely if I spend the entire competition either hating people or faking liking them. Then it would be really helpful, Izuku said, shooting her a smile. My hair is a disaster. Giggling, Mina let go of his arm and ruffled his hair. He realized that she was taller than him. Of course, she was wearing heels. But even without that, she probably would be taller, or maybe equally as tall. He had expected himself to be pretty tall, but it seemed he was in the wrong. He didn't mind per se. Towering over everyone would be awkward. Maybe he was fortunate to be short, for once in his life. The library was vast, a couple of stories high, books everywhere he looked. Despite its grandness, it felt quite crowded. There was a group of officials standing on a podium. No king or queen in sight. He saw Kayama and Aizawa, and a few more people their ages. And 23 other ladies were sharing the space, as Izuku and the others from his wing were the last ones to arrive. They were all looking impeccable. All dressed in soft colors except one other girl. A petite girl with long, green hair wore a dress similar to Izuku's. The cut was entirely different. The skirt was long and poofy, and she wore no sleeves, but the color was almost identical. Relieved to see he wasn't alone in the color choice, he excused himself from the conversation he was part of, not that he had actively taken part in the conversation, and he walked up to the girl. She was, like he had noticed, quite a bit shorter than him, with a round face and dark eyes. She looked kind, though her eyes held some sadness. She probably was a bit lonely, as most people had partnered up. There were a few people who stood on their own, but they looked content with it. We match, Izuku said enthusiastically, causing the poor girl to jump. Her squeak reminded him of a frog's croak. You scared me, she said. She looked him over. We do look alike. They talked for a bit. She introduced herself as a 𝗬𝗎𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬𝗬 admitted that she knew how to cuss like a sailor but wasn't willing to showcase her talents. She had never considered going into piracy. Izuku was pretty tempted by the idea, aside from looting people and destroying ships, which left him with the option of becoming sailor, so just seafaring. But before he could ask if she had been on the water and what it was like to be a sailor, one of the staff members called for their attention. "Ladies, if you would gather," a blonde man said, his voice booming. He looked a bit odd. His clothes were bright and not all that well tailored, not matching the colors of the palace or the uniforms the rest wore. However, he clearly was important, as none of the delegations was eyeing him with disapproval. Though the guy named Aizawa looked really impassive, as if genuinely trying to not show emotions. Seeing as how bright and loud the speaker was, Izuku could imagine Aizawa being annoyed with him. Walking over to the podium, Izuku regrouped with Uraraka, Mina, and 𝗬𝗂𝗁. Tsuyu looked like she wanted to join, but kept her distance. Beckoning her over, Izuku quickly introduced her to the other girls, who welcomed her with open arms. Not that he had expected any less. Both Uraraka and Mina were rather open, social people. 𝗬𝗂𝗁 was a bit quieter, but he had the feeling it was just a matter of time. "Now all 24 of you are here," the male continued. "We're going over a few things. From tomorrow on, breakfast starts around 8:30. You'll have breakfast, lunch, and dinner without the presence of the royal family unless they desire so. Unless required otherwise, you're free to wander around the castle and the castle grounds. Trips to the city will be arranged if there are enough requests. Curfew is at 11. Late-night wanderings are highly discouraged. In doubt, ask the staff. Be polite to them, they work for us, not you." If there are reports of mistreating our staff, you'll be eliminated from the competition. If you're reported for mistreating a fellow contestant, you'll face the chance of elimination. Those are the basic things we request of you ladies. You're guests here, after all, and we expect you to act like guests. Izuku felt himself nodding along. He liked that they would share breakfast. It was a lot better than having to sit in his room all on his own. The rules all seemed sensible, though he wasn't too fond of the restricted freedom. Back home, he could go anywhere without anybody batting an eye at him. But this was the palace, the home of the royal family. They would get a heart attack if he did the same things as he did back home. Sir, Mina's hand shot up in the air. The man was startled, blinking a few times before regaining his composure. Yes, do we have to exclusively court the prince or? 𝗳𝗪𝗃 shot Mina a small look of relief. Ah, of course, he shot a wink at Mina. As this isn't volunteer-based, we felt like it was unfair to demand exclusivity to the prince. After all, only one of you can marry him. You're allowed to pursue other relationships. However, a wry smile crept on his lips. If the prince desires to marry you, you have no choice. That's horrible, uraraka whispered. And Tsuyu nodded in agreement. Izuku felt a little ill. That was just cruel, forcing someone to marry you. Of course, this was the prince, the big guy who would take over the throne, but still, nobody volunteered to be here, so it gave the prince no right to just ruin any of their lives. What if he was a cold-hearted douche? Another girl's hand shot up in the air. Sir, she asked, her voice soft and polite. She shot Mina a stinky eye, who just stuck out her tongue. When are we going to meet Prince Todoroki? She asked. The man scratched his head, sharing glances between his co-workers. They must have worked together a lot, as a few heads tilt and facial expressions were enough of an answer. He's currently away, the man said, barely withholding a smile. But we have a temporary replacement. He'll judge in Prince Todoroki's place. Summoned, a young man walked up to the podium. He looked normal. He wasn't wearing the royal colors, instead, opting to wear a plain green tunic and brown trousers. His clothes looked well-tailored but didn't scream rich arse. He had a cap snugly put on his head, making it hard to identify his hair color and length. The biggest eye-catcher was the stark, red mark around his left eye that clashed with his pale skin. Izuku wasn't sure what it exactly was, but he didn't feel the need to look further into it. Unlike the group of staff members, the male looked anything but excited. He looked mostly bored, like he didn't want to be here. Izuku's brain agreed with this guy. He would rather not be here, considering it rude to stare so long. Izuku looked away. His focus once again returned to the blonde gentleman. We'll conduct interviews, the blonde explained. Shouto here, he gestured to the newcomer, will be the one asking the questions. This is to get a better grasp on who you ladies are. There were giggles of excitement, but Izuku only felt dread, a thought nagging at the back of his mind. What if this was a test? It would be brilliant. After all, at the end of the contest, only one girl would remain, the one who would marry Prince Todoroki. So 23 of the girls had to be eliminated from the competition. In the past, it wasn't unheard of that some of the girls were sent home after just the first day, which meant that he was most likely the first test, a test to see who they thought deemed fit to stay, and who might cause issues in the future and should get the boot. And nobody would realize, because it was under the guise of a basic introduction. And answer honestly, the blonde added, as if noticing some people realizing their real intentions. That's all. We're starting now. To avoid favoritism, the order is alphabetically by surname, so if Lady Ishido will come forward, the rest must stay here. Make yourself at home and wait for you to be called. Before Mina bounced upwards, Izuku hurriedly grabbed her arm, stopping her. It's probably a test, he whispered. Mina looked at him wide-eyed, before nodding and walking towards the podium and left with Shouto. What did you say? Uraraka asked, looking a little worried. Nobody looked at them. Well, aside from Tsuyu and 𝗳𝗪𝗃. Test, Izuku explained quietly. I think they're going to eliminate some of the girls after today. It's a contest, after all. Not all of us can marry the prince. He wasn't sure why he told Mina. It wasn't like she could suddenly do a 180 and become picture perfect. But maybe she would take it seriously and be honest. Maybe they looked for honesty, and not girls who just said what the prince wanted. Or maybe the prince was an actual, decent guy and tried to make the best of the situation, so looked for someone that he could get along with and shared interests with. Slowly, girls left the room. Tsuyu was immediately after Mina, and soon after, 𝗳𝗪𝗃 was called in. He and Uraraka had retreated into a corner, quietly whispering about what the questions could be. They both guessed that it was about why they would want to marry the prince. It would be a hard question because he didn't know the answer. Midoriya Izuku, the blonde guy, called. Izuku felt sick. He knew that his surname was somewhere in the middle of the list. About half of the girls were still hanging around the library by now, but he still was caught off guard. He wasn't ready for this. You will be fine, Uraraka encouraged. Smiling half-heartedly, Izuku walked over to the door leading to what he assumed was a small office. The weird thing was, he didn't want to go home, not quite yet. but he wasn't sure how he could convince Shouto to let him stay, as he didn't want to be dishonest, which meant he had to talk about his non-existing intentions to marry the prince. Izuku was pretty sure he was going to vomit. And Shouto wasn't a big help either. The guy was breathtakingly beautiful, but in a cold, impersonal way. His expression was blank. Despite the cap, which cast a dark shadow on his face, Izuku noticed that the red mark was textured and looked eerily familiar to a burn mark. The guy didn't even bother to crack a smile. "Sit," Shouto said curtly, nodding to a vacant chair. He sat down carefully, making sure his dress looked fine. He hoped that he looked representable enough for the prince's replacement. Izuku made sure that he made eye contact with the guy. The guy was unnerving, and Izuku realized that Shouto had two different colored eyes, one a steely gray, the other a cold blue. "Midoriya Haruka." Izuku nodded. "Why are you here?" "Excuse me." He mentally patted himself on the back for remembering to be polite. What kind of question was that? Did Shouto already figure out he was a guy? He assumed he looked pretty believable, as nobody had questioned it. Or the other girls just went with it. Shouto sighed tiredly. "What do you expect to gain out of this contest?" "A husband." Izuku tried his best to not show relief, but there must be something on his face as Shouto lifted an eyebrow in interest. "An adventure," Izuku said, feeling excitement bubble in his chest. "I never left my hometown before, so this is all new to me, and I've met new people, and they're all nice but so different, and I feel like I'm finally making friends, and there is so much to explore. I know that the palace is famous for its big gardens, and the city is actually located at sea, so that would be the first time I would see the sea." Without realizing, Izuku was rambling. He had been told he does that a lot, and it usually took a while for people to stop him. It annoyed people to no end, so it generally left Izuku feeling embarrassed and flustered, but it happened anyway. "Lady Midoriya," Shouto said, voice surprisingly kind. "We're on a time limit." Izuku's teeth clicked together painfully. Panic flooded his body. He just had spent his time rambling to the prince's replacement, who would judge him if he was suitable to stay or not. The guy only had managed to ask one question. "I'm sorry," Izuku mumbled. Looking up, the panic left him. Shouto wasn't mad at all. He was smiling. There wasn't a huge smile or big laugh lines on his face, but his entire body had relaxed significantly. His eyes twinkled, and there was even a faint smile on his lips. Izuku had officially made a fool of himself. "It's fine," he said, using the same kind tone he previously used. "I wasn't expecting it." Izuku was lost for words. Shouto probably thought Izuku was endearing, which was a wild concept. Well, as a girl, he wasn't too bad looking. Cute, he supposed. A little too buff, but he would lose the muscle once he stopped doing physical labor. But as a guy, he figured that being cute didn't really cut it, especially if you compared him to Kaken, the only male friend he had back home. Kaken, who now was training to become a knight, was a tough guy who looked every inch like a strong man. Izuku was generally seen as too soft, too kind, unable to cuss someone out, and he cried too quickly. He didn't mind these qualities, per se. It made him who he was. Shouto cleared his throat, quill tapping against the parchment. "Well, most of the questions are covered. Only 2 left, so it seems we still make time." Nodding, Izuku awaited the next 2 questions. He supposed he was in Shouto's good graces, so he hoped that he could keep that up. He didn't want to go home yet. Imagine, the prince gets the profiles of all the ladies participating, and he picks you. "You'll get married tomorrow." Shouto spoke like he had rehearsed this question. "Would you accept his offer?" "No," Izuku said immediately. Seconds later, he still didn't regret his answer. "No." Shouto didn't look angry, only slightly amused. "Care to explain?" Izuku bunched the fabric of his skirt in his fists, hoping to stop himself from shaking. "I'm not going to marry a man I don't know. I didn't sign up for this contest. I was chosen at random. I refuse to give up my freedom to someone I don't know. I don't desire riches or this kingdom. Honestly, politics bore me. I just want to meet people, see the world, help people out," and he hesitated, wondering if it was worth mentioning. Well, considering he already had dug his grave, he might as well. "I want to marry someone I love and who loves me back. Someone I can share my life and adventures." Shouto nodded as he jotted down Izuku's answer. It was less than favorable, but he wasn't going to lie to make himself look good, especially with risking the chance that the prince would want to marry him. The perfect little princess, pretty, soft, kind, and great at greeting guests and sitting at his side. "And what are your hobbies? Where do your interests lie?" Shouto asked. "For example, politics, horseback riding, making people smile." The last one was obviously improvised. Feeling slightly flattered and more at ease, Izuku managed to unclench his hands. "Woodcutting, well, that's more like work, but I really enjoy it. Gardening, reading, mostly history and fight tactics, doing puzzles. I like to cook together with my mom. A little wood carving, but nothing close to being professional. I also..." Izuku stopped abruptly as Shouto raised his hand. "Fight tactics?" Shouto asked, a small crease between his eyebrows. "Right, so far for not looking like an idiot." I'm a fan of All Might, Izuku said awkwardly, fidgeting in his seat and avoiding all eye contact. Usually, he was better with eye contact, but on the other hand, he usually spends time with people he knew. Shouto was a complete stranger. Izuku knew nothing of him. Their interview was cut short by knocking on the door which Izuku had gone through to enter this room. Time's up. The next one will arrive here soon, Shouto said. Shouto looked disappointed, which was reassuring. This meant Izuku most likely was going to stick around for a bit longer, or at least he had left a positive impact. Izuku got up, realizing he was trembling lightly. This had been quite nerve-wracking, worse than he had expected, maybe because Shouto was the one who was taking the interview. If it were one of the other staff members, Izuku would have done a lot better. Good luck, Shouto said, his eyes bright for a moment before his face grew hard again. Next girl, next interview, his face seemed to say. Thanks, Izuku said, bowing briefly before hurrying out of the room. His skirt fluttered behind him as his flats made soft thuds against the wooden floor, though all he pretty much could hear was the pounding of his heart. He opened the door at the same time as the other one was open, stepping into the hallway. The door had barely closed behind him when Mina barreled into him. You survived, she said, holding him in a death grip. I thought he was going to kill me. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 nodded in agreement, and even 𝗬𝗪 looked a little shaken, awkwardly patting Mina on the head. They moved a few meters away from the door after a knight glared at them. Did the guy seriously expect them to eavesdrop? During their retreat, Mina refused to let go, which made walking a little awkward. He wasn't so bad, Izuku admitted, managing to escape from Mina's grip. He got all three girls eyeing him with worry. Are you sure you okay? 𝗧𝗵𝗃 asked. Izuku nodded. You like him, 𝗬𝗪 stated. He isn't bad looking, he admitted. Mina giggled. Are you kidding? He is beautiful, she sighed wistfully. If he could only smile. Izuku swallowed, realization finally sinking in. Shouto had broken character during their interview, something he clearly hadn't done with the other contestants. Why though? Because he thought Izuku was a good fit with the prince? Or because he didn't see Izuku as competition at all, and decided to not be an ass? This honestly was all really confusing. The rest of the day passed in a blur. They, as in him, uraraka, 𝗬𝗪, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 and Mina, decided to spend their time in the garden. It was sunny for an autumn day, and after spending the morning cooped up in the palace, Izuku could use a breather. And they were the only ones in the garden, which meant privacy. Then there was dinner, with all the 24 girls. It was a bit chaotic, and more girls in one room Izuku would have liked. But he liked it. They spent the afternoon watching guards, scoring them on hotness. As curfew arrived, they all scattered off to their bedrooms, faking to be asleep. 15 minutes after curfew, Izuku heard doors open and close, followed by a knock on his own door. He spends a few hours in 𝗧𝗵𝗃's room, chatting with uraraka, Mina and 𝗧𝗵𝗃, speculating whoever was going to be sent home. The main suspects were themselves, though Izuku had a little bit of faith. Maybe Shouto wasn't a bad guy, though it would surprise him if all of them would stick around. After all, each of them had refused to marry Prince Todoroki on the spot. Around 2 in the morning, he carried a sleeping uraraka to her bedroom and Mina also snuck back to hers. He wasn't sure if the other girls had noticed their absence, and if they had, he hoped they wouldn't rat them out. Unlike the previous morning, Izuku wasn't ready to get out of bed. Yes, he wouldn't have to sit alone during breakfast. But it was cold, the bed was warm and soft, and he was tired. Going to bed late hadn't been a smart move, but honestly, joining the contest might not have been his smartest move. He was allowed to make dumb moves. With only minutes to spare, the noise in the hallway increasing by the minute, he got out of bed and changed into a loose-fitting dress. The sleeves flared out at the end, and the bottom brushed against the floor. For once, it wasn't green. Instead, it was a cream color, which didn't look all that bad, but it was a bit boring. But boring is good, he supposed. At breakfast, most likely the elimination was announced, and he would rather not be eye-catching. Slipping in a pair of sandals, Izuku ruffled his hair and left his room. The hallways were significantly less busy than yesterday. He only saw a maid, Mina, uraraka, and 𝗧𝗵𝗃. The 2 others might sleep in, or they were already downstairs, and the 4 of them would be eliminated. This is it, for us, isn't it? Uraraka whispered. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt and a high-waisted skirt. Her hair had small waves in them. I hope it isn't, Izuku admitted. I mean, I don't think Shouto particularly disliked me. Uraraka grinned brightly, mischief in her eyes. Or he likes you. In the back of his mind, he was aware he was gawking at uraraka, resembling a very red fish, but his body had completely shut down. Really, Shouto barely knew him, though he had to agree that Shouto didn't seem to dislike him. But it would be highly unprofessional. The maid did lead them to the dining hall, where only 14 other girls were. Identifying the few he knew, Izuku realized that all the groups had arrived. These were all the girls that were left. The other 6 were already eliminated and had left the palace somewhere in the dead of night, or very early in the morning. Maybe that's why the 2 other girls in their wing hadn't ratted them out, because they were no longer there. He saw the blonde from yesterday and Izuku slip into the dining hall, discussing things in hushed whispers, feeling like he could no longer stand and look innocent. Izuku sat down next to uraraka and a blue-haired girl. He had forgotten her name but knew that she slept in the same wing as 𝗬𝗪. 𝗬𝗪 had spoken positively about her. I don't get it, uraraka whispered, munching on a piece of bread that had a thick layer of butter on it. It seems that the candidates most vocal about wanting to marry the prince are eliminated. Mulling over uraraka's words, Izuku realized that she was right, which made no sense. Why would they get rid of the most willing contestants? Maybe they wanted to get rid of the more devoted people. But on the other hand, the prince wouldn't have a good time being married to a girl who isn't willing. The blonde guy from yesterday finally announced his presence. Ladies, considering beating around the bush would have no use, some might have figured it out already. He shot a wink in uraraka's direction, who flushed under the attention. This morning, 6 of the candidates were sent packing. This means that there are only 18 left. Yesterday was your first test. Sir, a girl with long, orange hair and a ponytail raised her hand. Will it be announced when the next test will come around? The blonde smiled, dare say, slightly crazy. Izuku saw that there was a definite crazy glint in his eyes. They got the perfect guy for this job, charismatic enough, but also perfectly aware what's going on and a little crazy. I fear not, Lady Kendu, he said. They will come as a surprise. We want to capture your genuine reaction. Life as a princess, as a queen, is filled with surprises after all. This was only day 3. He had arrived less than 48 hours ago, and he felt he had aged months already. And there was the possibility that he still had a month left of this craziness. Shouto hated this contest already. And this was the very first day he had to interact with the ladies competing for his hand in marriage. The idea was ridiculous, but it was a tradition. He was glad that his father had understanding enough to let him disguise himself as a servant. Or more like, he would have boycotted the competition if his father hadn't agreed. This way, he would meet the people like themselves and not some fake version of themselves. Of course, he would never be able to truly love them. His romantic attraction towards women was non-existing, but maybe he would find a life partner, someone who he enjoyed spending time with, and someone who would want to spend time with him. He wasn't going to force some poor woman into a loveless marriage like his father did. You look pained, 𝗬𝗪 remarked. Shouto hadn't heard the knight walking into the room, but was barely startled by his friend's sudden appearance. This wasn't unusual for him. 𝗬𝗪 was the son of important advisors of his father. His older brother, 𝗬𝗪-tensei, was the head of the guards. It wasn't surprising that he followed in his brother's footsteps. I spend hours interviewing the contestants. He groaned, stretching his arms till they popped. It was boring. Really, 𝗬𝗪's red eyes were slightly unnerving, but Shouto refused to break eye contact. There are plenty of lovely ladies among the bunch. There must be someone else than Momo who caught your attention. Momo was his other friend. Her family was good friends with his, so they had seen each other a lot as kids. It was no surprise that she also took part in the competition, handpicked by his father to be Shouto's future wife. Without meaning to, he recalled Lady Midoriya. She had seemed dull at first glance, not as pretty as some of the other women, not as sexy as some would call a woman. But she still stuck with him, her bright smile, her messy green curls, her freckles. The way she passionately spoke about her hobbies, how she grew flustered at the fact she was rambling. She wanted to see the world. If it had been up to Shouto, he would have taken her hand and traveled the world with her. Because the way she spoke about seeing everything, explore all the crooks and crannies of their kingdom, made Shouto long for the freedom he would never have. There is one, isn't there? Tell me, who is it? 𝗬𝗪 seemed genuinely interested. And he probably was. It was hard to make real friends as the crown prince, but 𝗬𝗪 had no issue pushing his buttons, annoying him and asking the stupid questions. Like this one, Lady Midoriya. 𝗬𝗪 frowned. No idea which one of them is Lady Midoriya. I only remember Momo's name, but that's because we know each other for so long already. Remembering all the names are going to give me a headache. Average height, green curls, green dress. To his surprise, 𝗬𝗪 didn't seem to criticize his choice, which he did with most choices Shouto made. Admittedly, most of them were stupid. I don't think she's a bad choice. I've seen her hanging out with her friends in the garden. All working-class commoners by the look of it, which is good. Good. They don't know how to be a rich ass. They either stumble or be brutally honest with you. He shouldn't have told 𝗬𝗪. Now he would expect Shouto to actually spend time with Lady Midoriya, getting to properly know her. She wasn't a bad choice, but the idea of chaining her to this palace didn't sit right with him. So he decided to veer the conversation into another direction. It sounds you speak of experience. Shouto couldn't help but grin triumphantly as 𝗬𝗪 grew flustered. Then he suddenly realized that 𝗬𝗪 has been keeping this a secret. You're seeing someone? He asked, genuinely hurt. 𝗬𝗪 shrugged, his face now starting to resemble a ripe tomato. Not yet, it's a work in progress. Please tell me that it isn't one of the competitors. Shouto didn't care if Tenya would run off with one of his competitors. It was unlikely that they would pick the same person, as their taste differed. But his father wouldn't be happy if Tenya snatched up one of the competitors. Random guards were one thing, but Shouto's closest friend? That could lead to nasty rumors and damage to their alliance. Of course not. Tenya sounded affronted. The king said I wasn't allowed. And I'm not insane to disobey his orders. Well, at least that was established. Then who is it? 𝗵𝘃𝗶𝗄. You're such a great friend. And you still have to do your homework. Tenya pointed to the notes he had made during the interview. You know that dinner time is the deadline. Shouto groaned. Yes, Mum, anything else? Try to get along with Lady Midoriya. It isn't often that someone leaves a positive impression on you. He wanted another friend. Where was Momo when he needed her? Izuku honestly didn't even want to leave the bathroom. Mina had said his hair looked fine, even better than normal after she had dumped half a bottle of natural oils in his hair. He had to admit, his curls looked fuller and springier. Mina's words, not his, but he felt like he hadn't showered in a week. People must think his hair looks greasy. It felt like his hair was greasy. Come on, let me see. 𝗳𝗃𝗁𝗧𝗵𝗃 begged, knocking on the door. We're basically the curly team. Uraraka shouted hey in protest. The curly team plus uraraka. 𝗳𝗃𝗁𝗧𝗵𝗃 corrected. And Tsuyu, outside the bathroom, the three of them were discussing names for their 5-member group. 2 days ago, after surviving the first elimination, Mina decided that they were officially a team. And a team needed a name. Glancing at the mirror, it was hard to keep looking. Not because Izuku looked ugly. No, he looked quite pretty actually. But it was a blow to his ego, to think that he would make a cuter girl than a guy. Of course, he wasn't as cute as uraraka, or as pretty as Mina, but still, he was more a catch as a girl than as a guy, which said a lot about his future chances at courting anybody. Deciding that having some sort of identity crisis wouldn't help him right now, Izuku happily removed his gaze away from the mirror and unlocked the bathroom door. The others must have heard the click, as their intense debate came to an abrupt end. Stepping out into the daylight-lit hall, he was met with 2 curious stares and 1 smug look that belonged to Mina. She really knew what she was doing, but that was expected as this was her trade. You smell like a flower garden, uraraka commented, sniffing in emphasis. It was the oils Mina had used. They all had that flowery scent to it. It was slightly overwhelming. 𝗳𝗃𝗁𝗧𝗵𝗃 just smiled, hugging Mina's arm in excitement. You have to do my hair next, she pleaded, looking up at Mina with big, doe-like eyes. It looks so pretty. While still proud of her work, Mina thankfully had the capability to be bashful, cheeks coloring dark and smiling a little shy. Thank you, Midoriya said, shooting Mina a smile. I know I was an awful customer, but you did a good job. Mina let out a burst of barking laughter. You are by far not my worst customer. I swear I already told you guys about this lady who wanted white hair. Simultaneously, the 3 of them shook their heads. Taking the floor, Mina started her spiel about the NTH customer who came with a ridiculous request. While Mina was talking, they wandered around the palace corridors, hoping to find the place they were going to meet up with Tsuyu for afternoon activities. Baking. In the royal kitchen, Izuku was surprised they got permission for that, as the servant had looked at them as if they were crazy. However, they had been redirected to 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗃, who was the loud blonde who had been giving the results of the first trial and had hosted the first trial. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗃 had been more than excited to give them access, which was a bit weird. On the other hand, Izuku had noticed that a few of the more important staff members have been picking favorites, and he had a feeling either he or uraraka was 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗃's favorite. So maybe not all that weird but just favoritism. For the first time in 6 days, counting arrival day, the group had decided to split up. Mina would be going to the city together with 𝗳𝗃𝗁𝗧𝗵𝗃. Uraraka wanted to send her parents a few letters, and Tsuyu had gotten permission to join a few of the staff members for a trip to the harbor. She explained she had missed the water and couldn't stand being cooped up in the palace. Nobody made fun of her, as they felt the same. They just didn't voice it as much as she did. This left Izuku the opportunity to wander the corridors all on his own, exploring the crooks and crannies of the palace, maybe finding secret doorways or trapdoors. He always had wondered if they only existed in the stories, or that they were real. Today was the day he would find out, or at least try to. The first few times were duds, but he had the feeling that this one was legit. Eyeing the bookcase, Izuku noted the lack of dust. Of course, the servants cleaned the library often, but this row of shelves was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in a dark corner. Most of the shelves were dusty, but this one wasn't. Considering that there was a wall behind the shelf made it all the more likely it was a hidden doorway. He had spent the last 10 minutes pulling old books from the shelf in the hope to activate the mechanism, but nothing worked. Of course, there was still the top row, but he couldn't reach it with his height. He could have fetched a chair, but he feared that one of the staff members would catch him and shepherd him away. His curiosity won. Grabbing the edge of the bookcase and placing his foot on the second lowest shelf, he gave himself a boost. The shelf groaned under his weight but held steady. He let out a sigh of relief. Izuku started to pull the books from the top shelf, carefully placing them back if nothing happened. He wondered what would happen if he actually did find a hidden door and would activate the mechanism. Would he be squashed between the wall and the bookcase? Or did the door open the other way around? Maybe this wasn't a good idea after all. Of course, the moment he decided that it was a bad idea, he was caught. "We have stairs." Being the fearful person he was, he yelped and nearly lost grip. After regaining footing once again, he carefully looked to his left where the newcomer was standing. It wasn't any member of the library staff, nor was it someone from the royal line. Instead, Shouto stood in the middle of the corridor, looking slightly amused. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Izuku shuddered. The guy looked pretty normal, wearing similar fashion as before, but right now he looked regal. He might as well be a prince or someone who spends a lot of time with the prince. Maybe that's why Shouto was picked to be Prince Todoroki's replacement. They were most likely friends. Good enough friends for Shouto to pick up habits from the prince. Honestly, Izuku carefully stepped back onto the steady ground. I was bored and decided to see if there were any hidden rooms, trapdoors, anything hidden or secret really. Why? Shouto looked god-honest confused. Seriously, why? Izuku laughed, raking a hand through his curls. Because I've never been in a palace, but all the stories say that there are secret passages, hidden basements, rooms behind bookcases. This is probably the only opportunity I get to explore a real palace, so why not? You're weird. Somehow, Shouto made the insult sound nice. But you aren't incorrect. This palace holds secrets. It does. Izuku could hardly contain his excitement. Shouto nodded. Why this bookcase though? This part of the floor is a dead end. It seemed that Shouto took a genuine interest in Midoriya's little game and wasn't just asking out of politeness. So Izuku explained everything he knew. For example, as this was a dead end, it's logical to have a hidden passage here. Additionally, not many people would venture here. These books were all duplicates. And the dust. Izuku spread his arms. I'm not dusty, am I? The other books are pretty dusty, but these all look pretty clean. The floor is also dust-free, so the room behind it must be regularly used. Of course, if there is a room. Before he truly realized it, he had told Shouto every idea and theory that he had come up with. It must have taken a while, yet Shouto hadn't bothered to stop him, instead of leaning against a bookcase, listening with interest. Once he ran out of things to say, awkwardness settled over them. For the first time, Izuku had run out of things to tell. You're correct, Shouto said awkwardly, about the hidden room. It isn't used a lot, except by me. He wanted to scream in joy. He was correct. How? It had been a wild guess, something to pass the time with and keep himself from going brain dead. Usually, he would go to his mum to discuss puzzles and riddles. She was quite supportive of his interest. But there was no mum here, and he couldn't just ask his friends to entertain him. He didn't want to bother them about something as silly as that. Can you show me? Izuku stepped closer to Shouto, almost grabbing the man's hand. Please, Shouto shrugged. Sure. Shouto pulled 2 books from the shelves, and a door swung open in silence. The door opened inwards, which Izuku was secretly thankful for. So far for worrying about being crushed between the bookcase and the window. The room beyond was pretty small for a living space. It was about as big as Izuku's bedroom. Only there was a couch, fireplace, single bed, chair, bookcase, desk, and even a small basin all stuffed into the room. It looked really cramped, but also cozy, like someone's personal getaway. You don't sleep here, right? Izuku asked, stepping into the living space. Behind him, Shouto pulled the door shut. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all, as now he was stuck in a room with a guy he barely knew. He must have looked afraid, as Shouto's expression shifted to worry in seconds. Shouto held up his hands in surrender. You could have said you're claustrophobic. I'm what? Fear for small spaces. Izuku shook his head. No, not Klaus. I'm not afraid of small space. It's just, I don't know you. Shouto stared at him owlishly. I'm a girl, you're a guy. Oh, Shouto shook his head. No worries. The king will have my head. He didn't sound particularly afraid of the king, which was surprising. Izuku had no idea what the king was really like. He had mostly heard rumors, some good, some bad. He wasn't a bad ruler, but he wasn't the friendliest person, so he would assume most of the staff members either worship him or be afraid of him. Shouto spoke about the title with disdain, believing Shouto, and knowing that he probably could outwit or outfight him if necessary. Midoriya carefully sat down on the desk chair. Finally looking at ease, face slack and emotionless mask gone, Shouto sat down on the bed. He looked at home in this room. Why did you let me stay? Izuku asked. If Shouto was startled by Izuku's question, he didn't show it. He just stared blankly at Izuku, before shaking his head. This caused his cap to fall off his head. A crown of white and red hair came visible, pulled back to the back. It was an odd color combination, but Shouto made it look good. Izuku stared way too long, and Shouto grew self-conscious, putting the cap back on. Izuku assumed that Shouto was wearing his hair in a ponytail, the reason it was pulled back like that, so he wondered what it looked like hanging loose, framing his face. Unfairly beautiful, most likely. You could have asked me anything. Shouto sounded amused. And you ask why you're still here. Aren't you happy to be here? Izuku shouted. Izuku stuttered through the next words. I'm happy to be here. It's a completely new experience. But I wasn't particularly favorable towards the prince, so I should have been the first one to go. Shouto seemed to be thoroughly amused, though his face showed little. Unlike the past contestants, the prince is looking for a wife who loves him for him, not someone who worships the floor he walks on. So that's why the biggest competitors had left. However, Izuku found it hard to agree with Shouto. It made no sense whatsoever to get rid of them. The prince must have forgotten one thing. Everyone here didn't sign up. Eliminating the few willing girls only leave the reluctant ones and the straight-up refusing ones. It's quite possible the prince will marry someone who never wanted to marry him, so their relationship will be strained and painful. Of course, they could fall in love during the contest, but that would require the prince to actually bond with the girls. Shouto looked a little uncomfortable, as if he had been the reason the girls had been sent home. The prince had made the final decision, or at least had given the instructions on what he deemed favorable for a wife and what he didn't. Sorry, Shouto mumbled. It's just, there is a reason the prince is currently away, and it's a real inconvenience for us. Being the real lady he was, Izuku snorted. I don't blame him. Good luck trying to bond with 18 girls individually. I would go insane. Thankfully, Shouto looked more at ease. I'm stuck here instead. And with how many of the girls do you talk to? Izuku wasn't sure if he was jealous about that, or slightly flattered. He mentally settled on flattered, as Shouto didn't seem to be a particularly social person. You like All Might, right? Izuku knew that Shouto tried to change the subject. He didn't know whenever Shouto was uncomfortable with the subject, or that he feared he would overshare on a subject he had no right talking about. Nonetheless, he accepted the change in subject and grabbed the opportunity to talk about All Might. And the best thing about it was that the conversation wasn't one-sided like they usually were with his mother. Shouto knew about the war hero, about his accomplishments, about his deeds outside of the war. He knew that All Might was just another human being. But sometimes the tales were borderlining another reality, as if he had popped straight out of a storybook. Shouto was also a fan. Before Izuku had realized it, dinner time was approaching. He had spent his lunchtime with Shouto, who had gotten some sandwiches from the kitchen. The rest of the afternoon, Izuku wasn't quite sure what they had done. Talking, probably. Well, Izuku did most of the talking. Shouto seemed to prefer to sit back and listen. Right now, they were wandering around a smaller garden. Izuku wasn't sure if they were allowed to be here, but the guards had let them pass with polite nods. Maybe Shouto had special privileges, being the prince's friend and all. So I was just doing my job. Winter is steadily approaching, and we needed the firewood, as sometimes it's too cold to leave the house, and this guy pops up out of nowhere. Of course, I was startled, and if the guy hadn't dodged out of instinct, I might as well had committed murder. Do all messengers have this sense of bravery, running up to people swinging axes? Or was he just an exception? Shouto was chuckling a little, which Izuku deemed as an accomplishment, though he wondered why this story was particularly funny. He just had told Shouto how he nearly beheaded the messenger that brought the news of Haruka's participation in the contest. They need to be brave, Shouto said, guiding Izuku to a bright red tree. But bright is a different story. Izuku was about to sit down on the bench placed underneath the tree. His legs were a bit shaky when a guard strode towards them. The uniform didn't seem to fit him all that well, and it clearly wasn't the same as the ones the Royal Knights wore. Maybe he was new, or hired help. Well, the only thing Izuku could conclude was that the guy was clearly heading towards them. Can I help you? Shouto asked, voice steely and professional. The knight nodded, taking his helmet off. A sense of dread pulled in Izuku's stomach. The spiky blonde hair was currently flat, but his scowl and red eyes were unmistakable, especially as Izuku spent his entire life living next to this guy. Well, till he left to become a knight. It was Bakugo Katsuki, or Kaken as Izuku is used to calling him, the only boy his age back home. Haruka, Kaken asked, looking surprised to see him here. You know each other? Shouto asked, looking between the two of them. Izuku was relieved that Shouto had just written it off as a surprise, which might be for the best. He wasn't particularly fond of Kaken. Yes, he looked up to the blonde. He was amazing, and virtually everything Izuku wanted to be, but he never seemed to like Izuku. Maybe because Izuku cried too much. Maybe because he got along better with the girls than Kaken. Maybe Kaken didn't like anyone. Yes, we're from the same village, Kaken answered. Sir, it was a surprise to hear Kaken being polite. On the other hand, cussing out your employee or their important staff members wasn't the brightest idea, so he had to be polite for the sake of keeping his job. Neither guys seemed to be fond of each other. They were eyeing each other with hostility, Kaken going as far as grinding his teeth. If Shouto had been a less important figure, Kaken probably would have attempted to fight him in one way or another. He both could throw a mean hook and mean words. Shouto was the one to give in, shoulders slumping and the anger melted off his face, though the cool mask that came in return caused more discomfort than the hostility he previously wore. It's nearly dinner time. I'll leave you two to catch up, Shouto said, his gaze turning sharp as he addresses Kaken. Bakugo, will you escort Lady Midoriya to the dining hall once you're finished? Suddenly the hostility made sense. Izuku had told Shouto about Kaken. It's a hard subject to avoid when you basically grew up together. So Shouto's opinion on Kaken made a lot of sense. And Kaken just didn't like rich, privileged people who could sit all day on their arse and earn more money than others ever would. Once Shouto was out of their sight, Kaken stepped closer, grabbing Izuku's shoulders. What are you doing here? He hissed, shaking Izuku lightly. You're supposed to get married next spring, and you're flirting with him. Flirting? Izuku wasn't flirting with Shouto. He was just talking with Shouto because Shouto was a good listener. He always seemed to know what Izuku was talking about, added things here and there, and he allowed Izuku to borrow from his personal library, which held more books about All Might than Izuku could dream of. He's just nice. Izuku sniped back, refusing to let this adventure being ruined by Kaken. And Haruka will get married in the spring. But apparently I'm convincing enough as a girl that you didn't notice the difference. Or you never care that much to begin with. Kaken balked as the puzzle pieces clicking into place. Midoriya. Izuku corrected, struggling to not stomp his feet like a little kid. And yes, Haruka got selected to join the competition, so I volunteered to go instead. Doesn't explain what you're doing here. You haven't finished the academy yet, have you? No, they needed extra hands here. With the contest going on, Kaken completely glossed over the fact that Izuku had gone in Haruka's stead. No thank you, no. Complete silence. The bell rang, signaling that dinner was going to start soon. Not that Izuku was focusing on that. Despite that Kaken hadn't graduated yet, he was still miles behind him. Kaken was already getting field experience, showcasing his natural talent. And Izuku was spending his time playing dress-up. It was so frustrating, as he wanted Kaken to treat him as an equal. But it seemed that wouldn't happen anytime soon, especially now he had seen Izuku in a dress, cozying up with the prince's friend. You don't have to escort me. I will find my way, Izuku said, feeling hot tears coming up. For this first time, he started to regret his decision to volunteer to go in Haruka's stead. Turning heel and stalking towards the exist, Izuku didn't get very far. Kaken had grabbed his arm, forcing him to a standstill. You're an idiot, Bakugo said. Geez, Izuku felt a few tears spill, which he hurriedly wiped away with his free arm. I didn't know that. And thank you, Kaken said, voice almost pained, for being an idiot. This was the closest Kaken had come to complimenting someone, and it made Izuku both swell up with pride and slight worry. Maybe Kaken was falling ill. Okay, I still don't want an escort. I'm not stupid enough not to listen half-half, Bakugo grumbled. I will escort you. Turning around, glaring at Kaken with teary eyes, Izuku gave a definite shake of his head. I'm not a maiden in distress. I can punch someone in the face if necessary. Kaken almost smiled and let go of Izuku's arm. As this was most likely the only chance he would get, Izuku fled out the garden, hoping to stumble across a bathroom to clean up. He probably looked like he had been crying for a while, and he didn't want to worry anyone. It was unlikely he would see Kaken again anytime soon. This palace is massive. Also, Kaken probably would ignore him. At least that would be merciful. It was day 8, and there had been no new elimination challenge. People had started to grow restless, Izuku included. There were still 18 people left, and he doubted they would get rid of a large group of them all of a sudden. Yet, despite the uneasy feeling, Izuku was equally cheerful as the rest of the girls when they announced that they would visit a neighboring village to go sightseeing and shopping. They wouldn't need an awful lot, just some money and walking shoes. Heels were traded in for boots or flats, and Izuku decided to take a coat with him. While it was autumn, he knew that the autumn weather could be treacherous. Up where he lived, the temperature could drop in a blink. In seconds, the sun could be gone, the wind had picked up, and suddenly you wished you brought a coat with you. It felt as they've been traveling for hours. Izuku was crammed into the carriage together with Mina, Hagakure, and Uraraka. Well, it wasn't necessarily crammed, as there was space for 6, but Izuku felt like he was suffocating. The curtains were drawn, and they weren't allowed to open them. There was little fresh air in. A long time ago, they had gotten bored. There was a big difference from chatting for hours in a bedroom, with a warm fire, on a soft bed in pajamas and sitting on semi-comfortable cushions, in a closed-off space that had been shaking and groaning for the last 10 minutes. The shaking had gotten bad enough for Uraraka to look a little nauseous. Groaning in protest, the carriage came to a halt. There were collective sighs of relief. Now he prayed that they had arrived at their destination. Otherwise, Izuku was tempted to wrench open the door and just abandon carriage. It was even better than abandoning a ship because he at least would land on solid ground. The door was opened by the coachman, who looked politely bored. He wasn't at least faking a smile. The male had blonde hair with a black streak, electric yellow eyes, and was average of height. It was hard to figure out what kind of person he was from expression alone because, as previously mentioned, he looked bored. "We arrived, ladies," he said, offering his hand. There was no need for that, as Uraraka nearly jumped out of the carriage, wheezing and gulping air. She thankfully didn't vomit. The rest followed, all ignoring the coachman's hand in favor of leaving the damp, hot box of death behind. They better must have a good reason to close the windows, because Izuku would like to sign a complaint somewhere, something along the lines of nearly died of suffocation. Looking around, Izuku saw a wide expanse of wood. Turning around, he saw a rather large lodge. It looked expensive and pretty weather-tight. It probably belonged to the royal family, or someone else incredibly wealthy. It was large enough to fit the royal family and some of their most important staff members, which was more than what Izuku could say about most lodges he had seen. Most of them only had one floor, and about 2 bedrooms, a small bathroom, and a cramped living, dining, and kitchen space. This one probably could house 10 people easily. The coachman climbed back on his seat, gathering the reins. He nodded at them politely, before shooting them a cheeky grin and waving a hand in goodbye. "Hey, where are we staying?" Mina shouted as the coachman spurred on the horses, leaving them at the lodge. The coachman had, thankfully, the decency to at least react on Mina's question. His answer was almost entirely useless. "See you tomorrow, ladies." Izuku was pretty sure the coachman was cackling. By the looks of it, they were stuck here. "What are we going to do?" Hagakure asked worriedly. "Are we supposed to stay here at the lodge?" "No idea." Mina tried to unlock the door, but no luck. Locked. Figuring that they couldn't sleep outside with the current temperature, Izuku decided to explore the grounds. Maybe he found something, a sign of life. Maybe a back door. It was possible the owners would return eventually. "I'll look around," he announced. "I'll join you," Uraraka said, sounding a little weakly. She still looked a little pale but no longer green, so that was an improvement. "I could use some fresh air." He teamed up with Uraraka and started to circle the lodge. There was no carriage, and Midoriya noted that there was no sign that there recently had been a carriage here. The water basin is completely empty, which seemed poor treatment towards the horses. Additional to that, there was no trace of wheel tracks of hoof prints. It was completely deserted. "Midoriya, if you're finished playing detective, could you help me?" Looking away from the non-existing tracks, he saw Uraraka attempting to climb a tree. The tree was located pretty close to the lodge, maybe a jumping distance away from a window. Looking up so he could see the first floor, he saw that there was a large window. However, it was securely closed so they couldn't enter through there. The curtains might not be drawn. Uraraka sounded slightly out of breath, trying to haul herself up. "Not success so far. Trees discriminated against short people. I can check if there are people upstairs." Izuku doubted that anyone was home, but it couldn't hurt. Maybe they at least could figure out how many bedrooms there were, in case they had to stay. Halfway towards Uraraka, Izuku froze. They were stuck here, probably not close to a village, and they had little to no money. This lodge was the place they were going to stay for the night. Despite that the size was fit for a king, it would never fit 18 people properly. Probably 12 at best, if they had proper couches. "What's wrong?" Uraraka asked, shaking his head. Ridding himself of the whirlwind of thoughts, Izuku moved over to Uraraka. "I will tell you later," Izuku promised and helped Uraraka into the tree. Their combined shortness was enough to boost Uraraka up to a sturdy branch. She tentatively climbed a few more, until she had a proper view on the window. "The curtains are closed," Uraraka said, pouting. "So they either like the dark, or there is no one in there." No for long, Izuku thought. He was quite sure that they would be spending their night there, though he wondered how a survival of the fittest trial would fit in with the whole competition, because he knew that most of the rich didn't know a thing about putting their head together and make the best of a bad situation. They got most of it handed to them on a silver platter. The last bit of Uraraka's descent was cushioned by Izuku, who awkwardly held her in his arms before letting go. Jumping had been his idea, as the last part was pretty high and he was too short to lift her out of the tree. "I'm guessing 5 bedrooms, Midoriya said after they made another round, purposely counting the windows, and 2 bathrooms. As there was nothing more to be seen, they walked back to where the others were. Uraraka had been a bit down from the fact that her tree climbing had resulted in nothing. "Being rich must be nice," Uraraka mumbled. "Your vacation home is big enough to fit your family and your main staff. I would have to room with siblings if I had any." It sucked seeing Uraraka moping about. Izuku understood where she was coming from. He lived in a 2-bedroom house which was actually too small for 2 bedrooms. "And you parents will marry you off at the age of 18, he commented, trying to cheer Uraraka up. He hoped that she understood what he was trying. Uraraka's mood seemed to improve at least a little, joining in on the fun. "You're stuck in uncomfortable clothes. You must get babies because they need heirs. It sucks to be a woman because you're shipped off to another family. Though liking the same sex isn't much better. Same-sex love means no biological children." Uraraka was almost cackling. Imagine that the next crown prince is adopted, and you have to know your family history and never cuss. Uraraka gasped in horror. They aren't allowed to cuss, even though they were still quite a bit away. Their laughter had grown loud enough for the other two to notice. Unsurprisingly, it was Mina who commented first. "Hey, what are you two laughing about?" she shouted, waving her fist in faux annoyance. "I don't like missing out on jokes. Rich people aren't allowed to cuss," Uraraka explained between giggles as soon as they met up. "It's improper." He doubted that rich people never cussed. But his mother would just sigh if Izuku accidentally cussed, when he, for example, dropped something, or accidentally cut himself in the finger while helping in the kitchen. He wouldn't get a lecture, just a sigh. They came up with a few more ridiculous reasons why it would suck to be rich, mostly to keep the feeling of dread at bay. He hoped that the door of the lodge would be unlocked eventually. Otherwise, he was seriously considering smashing in a window and risking disqualification for destroying property. They wouldn't have enough money to stay at an inn or tavern, and freezing to death didn't sound appealing at all. An eternity later, though based on the sun it must be around 11:30, the second carriage arrived. Tsuyu, a girl with long, baby blue hair and a blonde, got out. He was pretty sure the blue-haired one was called 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧, but he was clueless about the blonde. It just showed how well he knew his competition. "Nakagame tatami," Mina whispered. "From a family of sailors like Tsuyu. The other is Hado 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧, always called 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧. She is from a family of musicians." Izuku was amazed by how well Mina knew their competition. Yes, she was the most sociable one out the five of them, but still, he hadn't seen her talk with many others. But maybe she had these skills that she just knew things, just like his mother often knew how to treat illnesses on instinct, or how Uraraka instantly could sniff out where food was. Tsuyu walked over to them, joining their conversation. Though the conversation had by now fallen flat, worry rising. After all, the second carriage had left two, increasing the group with three but leaving them all clueless. This coachman didn't even bother to tell them they would be picked up tomorrow. "I think I'm onto something," Midoriya whispered, unsure if he wanted to share this with the other two girls. "I hope that I'm wrong though." Mina raised an eyebrow, hands on her hips. "You sound like you're trying to solve a murder." 𝗬𝗂𝗁 giggled, Uraraka snorted, and even Tsuyu cracked a smile. Mina smiled proudly, and belatedly Izuku realized that she just had tried to lighten the mood. "Well, I'm not, though there could be murder." He wasn't sure how much bloodshed would happen today. He knew that girls could be quite vicious, though he was sure that they were smart enough to know that killing fellow competitors would result in imprisonment, unless it was foolproof and nobody suspects you. Now he was thinking about a murder that wasn't going to happen. "I think that there are about 5 bedrooms in this lodge, and there are 18 girls. Add 2 and 2 together." Mina hissed through her teeth. "This is going to be painful. I have siblings. Putting us together in a cramped space always brings the worst out of us. But what are we going to do about it?" Tsuyu asked matter-of-factly. "Work together. Seems the most sensible thing to do." "I don't mind cuddling," 𝗬𝗂𝗁 piped in. "I'm not sure about you guys, but seeing as there are 5 bedrooms, according to Midoriya, we are bound to share a room with the 5 of us if we work together. We could split up, but there is strength in numbers. Assuming that there would be one master suite. No way the king would sleep in a tiny-ass bed. It could be the answer to their problem. If none of them was too uncomfortable about the cuddling, that is. It helped that they were all pretty short, though not line. His and Uraraka's work didn't allow for thin arms and planned diets. And none of the other girls was exactly petite. "I think our best bet is to grab the master bedroom," Izuku offered. "I think we can share the mattress if nobody is uncomfortable with sharing personal space. The bed is probably the biggest. Why not multiple rooms?" Uraraka wondered. "I mean, 2 bedrooms would be ideal." For a few moments, Izuku wondered why they wouldn't do that, but going over his plan he realized why he had gone with 1 bedroom. "I doubt that the doors can be locked from the outside, so that will limit us to our rooms or risking losing them. And here I thought it was all about poofy skirts and looking pretty." Mina had a wicked grin on her lips. "Turns out that you need brain cells for this. Thank heavens we have Midoriya." Uraraka grabbed his arm. "She covers our asses." Izuku couldn't help but feel flustered. "Not sure if that's so smart." "What, relying on you?" "Yes," Izuku exclaimed, voice growing pitchy. "I mean, I just tend to overthink. I might be completely wrong, and there is a village next door we're staying at." "And you might not be wrong," Tsuyu said. "I mean, this is a competition. And I feel like most of us forget that." "You don't." Izuku wanted to protest that he, in fact, kept forgetting that this was a competition. Partially because they hadn't met the prince yet, partially because he spends most of his time with his friends, who would be exactly like the friends he could have had them back home. And there was Shouto, who he enjoyed spending time with. However, his words died on his lips as the third carriage arrived. They had bigger things to worry about. like the fact that their biggest competition has arrived. Group 3 existed out of the all-around favorites. They weren't horrible people, not at all, but these were the girls expected to marry the prince. Izuku wasn't going to make it any easier for them, despite not particularly interested in marrying the prince himself. "Hey Mina," Uraraka whispered, successfully distracting all of them of the arrival of the main competition. "You're the tallest, right?" They compared heights, and indeed, Mina was the tallest of them. Izuku came a close second, but Mina was wearing small heels that just gave her an edge. "Do you think if you can check the doorpost, the top of it?" Mina didn't stand a chance against the height of the door, so as inconspicuous as possible, Izuku lifted her on his shoulders. A small gasp followed, and Mina grabbed something from between the wooden slats. They had gathered some attraction, but they moved away from the door and just started to chat. While Mina was telling them a story about her only brother back home, she showed what she found between the slats. "Knew it," Uraraka said triumphantly. "We hide our key in case of an emergency. It's hard to find for anyone that isn't over 6.5 feet tall. But what are we going to do with it?" 𝗧𝗵𝗃 asked. "Is it fair to already entered the lodge?" "Not really. The last group is with 6, and if Midoriya's predictions are correct, there are only 10 to 12 bed spaces. The last group ends up picking up the scraps," 𝗬𝗪 pointed out, eyebrows creased in concertation. "So we'll wait," everyone agrees. They all agreed with 𝗬𝗪, though it didn't make the wait easier. It was around noon when they decided that the rest of the competition had eased in a false sense of security. Some of the girls were a bit at unease, some complained about the dirt, others mentioning that they were hungry, but it seemed that most of them assumed that they would be picked up, or that the owners of the lodge still had to return. So Mina, who had become their unofficial leader, decided that no time would be better than now. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 was surprisingly good at theatrics, wherein the others most likely would have announced their plans by just being loud. No annoyance in sight, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 did a wonderful job. She sounded annoyed, her voice raised so that the rest of the girls could hear it too. "Maybe the door is jammed," she said, frustration thick in her voice. "I mean, did you guys really try?" "We tried, remember, but see for yourself." Mina wasn't as good as 𝗧𝗵𝗃, but she at least sounded annoyed. The hunger might be getting to her too. The cracks in their friendship had gotten the girls whispering, giving 𝗧𝗵𝗃 enough time to unlock the door without them noticing. A few seconds later, she gave them the thumbs up, and she opened the door and slipped inside. Nobody had noticed anything yet. In a hurry, knowing it won't take long before everyone caught up on what was going on, Izuku followed 𝗧𝗵𝗃 inside with Uraraka hot on his heels. The ground floor mostly existed out a living, dining and kitchen area. The living area had been entirely stripped bare, only a wooden coffee table remaining, and the fireplace. A big banner hangs from the ceiling, reading "Have a nice stay," with a few suns drawn on it. "I wished you weren't right," Uraraka said after she read the banner too. "But time to grab a room." Looking around, Izuku almost missed the stairs. It was tucked away against a wall, the steps almost perfectly blending in with the slats. The only reason he noticed them was that he spotted the bright yellow flutter of 𝗧𝗵𝗃's dress disappears out of view. "That way," Izuku said, pointing the way 𝗧𝗵𝗃 disappeared. "And we have to hurry." The conversations outside grew noisier, which meant that the rest of the girls were coming close, curious about what was hiding behind the door. The second floor had 7 doors, which suited Izuku's theory just fine. 5 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, though maybe the second bathroom was downstairs. The curtains were drawn, basking the hall in sunlight. The door at the end of the half, on the left, was thrown open. "Do you have the master bedroom?" Mina shouted excitedly, running past Izuku and Uraraka. Ignoring 𝗬𝗪's disappearance, she was perfectly free to do what she saw necessary. He and Uraraka started to open doors at random, making sure that 𝗧𝗵𝗃 had gotten the master bedroom. She hadn't. The second door on the right, which only had 3 doors, lead into a large bedroom, fitted with a big bed, a wardrobe, a fireplace, a desk and a chair. "What is 𝗧𝗵𝗃 doing?" Uraraka asked, worried. "Already opening the wardrobe doors in search of blankets. It will be hard to hold Ford split up like this." They found a few blankets and pillows, which was good. They at least have something to sleep under and rest their heads on. Footsteps pounded against the wooden steps as the others were making their way upstairs. This was seriously looking like a survival spiel, and Izuku didn't like it one bit. Why couldn't they just force them to take tests, show manners, ask them about politics? He would suck at it, but at least it felt more in place than this. This would be more fitting if he would have been at the night academy. Blocking the doorway, he and Uraraka watched as the other girls flocked the floor, entering and leaving rooms, bickering, but thankfully not hitting each other. A triumphant scream caused everyone to jump, but it was worth the fright. Mina and 𝗧𝗵𝗃 left their bedroom carrying a mattress between them. Despite being smaller than the one he and Uraraka currently were guarding, it was impressive that the two of them could carry it, especially between the gaggle of girls. It turned out that Izuku still had a lot to learn about girls because he had expected some kind of catfight. But aside from whines, grumbles, and a few pissed-off looks, the girls were peaceful. The mattress flopped onto the ground with a loud thud. Well, partially. The master bed was in the way, taking center stage in the room. I think we have to renovate the room, Mina concluded. You think? Izuku laughed. I think we have to get rid of the bed frame. It was a shared effort to lift the mattress from the bed and putting the bed frame up against the wall. They were still debating whenever or not use it as firewood when 𝗬𝗪 finally turned up. Her arms were wrapped around a bundle of blankets and pillows. Where did you get that? Uraraka asked, eyes sparkling with excitement. It looks like you robbed a linen closet. I did, 𝗬𝗪 said. You can never have enough blankets. Izuku wanted to protest, wanted to say that they only needed the necessary, but Uraraka looked so excited that he didn't have the heart to protest. She was really cute like that, though it didn't make his heart race as he had expected. Maybe it was the nature of the contest or the fact that Uraraka liked girls. Though his heart definitely had skipped a few beats around Shouto, so it couldn't just be the contest. Or maybe his brain was reasonable for once and realized that crushing on girls who liked girls didn't work. Not that Shouto liked guys, so that was that. Once their room was decked out, they decided that the most important thing was getting wood. The house wasn't really windproof, despite its size. The pretty facade had just been for show. And currently, it wasn't so bad, but it would get awfully chilly at night. Additional to that, they needed wood to create a fire for cooking. So who is going to get the wood? Mina asked. All eyes zeroed in on Izuku. Feeling uncomfortable under their gaze, Izuku tried to make himself as small as possible. Why me? 𝗬𝗪 blinked in surprise. You're the lumberjack. He wanted to hit himself. He was so stupid, he had forgotten that he basically worked as a lumberjack. It wasn't his family's main source of income. That was his mother's job as a healer, but he earned some pocket money by chopping wood for others. He was young, fit, and one of the people without a steady job in the village. Uraraka started to laugh. You forgot your own craft. I do it on the side. Izuku blurted out. My mom earns most of the money. I just run errands if necessary and chop wood. Midoriya is doing the chopping. Who is going to do the carrying? They had figured that some of them had to stay in the room to avoid being robbed. It wasn't their stuff, but surely someone would drop by and grab it if they're left alone. This was a test after all. And secretly, all of them were a little bit competitive. I will. Uraraka volunteers. Seconds later, 𝗬𝗪 volunteered to help them. To his relief, nobody had bothered to touch the shed yet. He somehow doubted that any of them had actually chopped wood in their life, as it wasn't really a woman's job. But on the other hand, most likely, most of the candidates probably had a father in their life who did that job if necessary. Even if Izuku had been born a girl, he still would have to gather the wood or pay for it, as his mother didn't have the time and there was no father figure in his life. Looking at the tools, Izuku grabbed a solid-looking axe, 3 sets of gloves, and 2 buckets. He doubted the others wanted to work themselves into a sweat cutting wood. And if they wanted, they always could come back to get an axe themselves. Are you sure that you don't mind? Uraraka asked as they moved further into the forest. It's a hard job. This isn't too bad, Izuku answered. Gaze settled on a 12-inch tree. It's a pretty small one, as we're only staying for one night. After putting on a pair of gloves and testing out the balance of the axe, Izuku started to cut down the tree. 12 inches wasn't a lot. And in 5 minutes, the tree was tipping over and crashed against the ground. He had worked up quite some sweat, but he didn't mind. He somehow had missed this, though he belatedly realized that his dress was going to smell a bit iffy. But it wasn't like he could go bare-chested right now. He would give himself away to Uraraka and 𝗬𝗪, and anyone else that might walk in on them. Wow, 𝗬𝗪 breathed, staring at the tree. Uraraka sucked in a breath. Wow, indeed. I know that my dad would hire you in a heartbeat. Flustered and painfully unsure how to answer, Izuku opted to just start to cut up the tree in sizable pieces. He was glad he was wearing leggings and a long-sleeved dress because splinters were flying everywhere. In the background, 𝗬𝗪 and Uraraka were chatting, but he couldn't find it in him to join them. The sooner this was over, the better. His stomach was getting upset with hunger. The only good thing was that the fireplace was pretty big, which meant that he didn't have to cut everything in small pieces. First one, he announced. Not wanting to cut wood with 𝗬𝗪 so close to him, he helped her put the wood pieces into the bucket. By the looks of it, it was about 6 of these buckets, maybe a couple more. And then there was just small stuff like twigs and such to start the fire. 𝗬𝗪 disappeared with the bucket, hauling it along as if weighted nothing. He seriously didn't want to fight with any of these girls. Hey, before you continue, can I ask you something? Uraraka sat down on a big chunk of wood. Putting down the axe, Izuku leaned on its wooden end. Sure, is it about 𝗬𝗪? Uraraka grew flustered. No, not about 𝗬𝗪. No, I wanted to ask, do you like Shouto? Yes. The way Uraraka's face lit up made him realize he had the wrong interpretation of the question. Not like that. He's nice, but what? He's part of the palace staff. Once I leave this competition, I won't ever see him again, and I don't want my first heartbreak to be like that. I'm not Mina, she is better at this romance stuff. However, Uraraka smiled encouragingly at him. I think it's worth to try. He clearly thinks you're interesting, and you have to experience love at some point. Do you think it happens once you return to home? Izuku shook his head. No, but how can you be so sure that Shouto likes me? I'm one of the candidates. He probably tries to measure who the prince will like. That's why he hasn't spoken with any of us. What? Uraraka grinned triumphantly. So you are interested. But Mina told me she and 𝗧𝗵𝗃 know everything. Shouto only talks with you and Momo. That's 𝗧𝗫𝗫𝗀𝗀, and it seems he and Momo know each other from before the contest. Unsurprisingly, really, as the 𝗧𝗫𝗫𝗀 family is close to the Todoroki family, just like the information courtesy of Mina, again. He could vaguely recall Momo as being tall, elegant with a black ponytail. She was quite pretty and well-suited to be a queen. But just think about it. Uraraka got up, making sure she was a safe distance away. It'll be worth it, I promise. The day had passed in a blur. It had taken Izuku longer than he liked to cut up the wood, which means that their lunch had been postponed until somewhere around 3 in the afternoon. Not that it had been unproductive. Mina had gathered information like the ninja she was and had made a deal with the girls sleeping next to them. There were just 2 of them, Nejiire and 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 vouched for, and they needed food, but couldn't leave their room. Their advantage laid in the fact that they had money, and Izuku and his friends hadn't. At least not enough to buy lunch and dinner, even if they would make both from semi-scratch. Mina and 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 had fetched the food from a neighboring village, about 2 miles away according to another source. Once again, Mina had made a deal. One of the 3 girls, she was called Shizaki, who was a tall girl with vibrant green hair and soft expression, knew her way around. However, she alone couldn't carry all the groceries they would need, so she would share the load with Mina and 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 in exchange for getting them to the village. Around sundown, the lodge had grown quiet. Mina had created a web of alliances, all benefiting them without offering big promises. They had lunch, dinner, and they even had managed to get a few candles. Candles weren't necessary per se, as the fire in the fireplace was burning brightly, warming the room quite nicely. But if one of them had needed a bathroom break, it was nice to walk around with a proper light instead of relying on your wits alone, especially as the bathroom upstairs was locked from the inside, the girl blackmailing them into giving her a room. Nobody had given in, so she was still there. So it was the downstairs bathroom or out in the wild. This isn't all bad, Uraraka said, snacking on some of the leftover food. The whole survival of the fittest aside, it's like a sleepover. She wasn't wrong. With the fireplace casting a cheery light and warming up the room was pretty livable for a group of people wearing mostly dresses. And with the mattress thrown onto the ground, and the many pillows and blankets, it really felt homely. We should have a real sleepover after this, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 said excitedly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. With permission, we can do each other's hair, share stories, eat snacks, and stay up all night talking. Tsuyu leaned her head against Uraraka's shoulder, yawning. Seems fun, she admitted, especially when I don't have to wear a dress to sleep. There were mutters of agreements, especially 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 and Uraraka. Uraraka's dress left her shoulders and arms bare, and 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁's dress had been splattered with mud. The smell wasn't too bad, but the dress clung to her skin like a second layer, and the dried mud started to crumble off. There was a big risk that they would be rolling in the mud during the night. You can have my leggings, Izuku offered a sad-looking 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁, not quite sure if that would make any difference. Well, her legs might not feel that sticky anymore. I don't mind, I'm used to a little bit of cold. Mina's face lit up. Then you can have my top. Before anyone could protest, Mina took off her blue, long-sleeved top. Underneath the top, she wore a sleeveless shirt, still covering plenty. When 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 stared at her with big eyes, she just shrugged. Like Midoriya, I'm used to the cold, and I think it will look cute. Midoriya awkwardly wiggled out of the leggings, passing the pair to 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁. They were pretty clean, considering he had spent quite some time chopping wood in them. His legs felt bare and slightly cold, but it was better to both brighten 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁's mood and not having to sleep among the mud and other dirt that had caked 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁's dress. Armed with new clothes, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 took one of the candles, lit it with the help of the fireplace, and headed out towards the bathroom. Thanks for your sacrifice, Uraraka bowed. I wasn't sure if I could sleep knowing that I might be rolling in mud. Mina huffed. It's nothing. She will feel cleaner like this, and I'm probably the one sleeping close to her, so it was perfectly selfish. Though I would have killed for your top, Uraraka said, rubbing her bare arms. Izuku hated how late he realized that he wore a coat on this trip and that the coat laid somewhere forgotten among the stacked up firewood. I have a coat, he offered to Uraraka, vaguely gesturing to the pile of wood. Not sure where I left it. Uraraka dramatically threw off the blanket as she got up, searching for Izuku's jacket. Uraraka let out a triumphant noise when she found it, waving it around. Now I'm settled for the night, she cheered, her mood improving greatly. Now if 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 can come back. As if hearing Uraraka's call, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 slipped back into the room. The clothes didn't fit quite right. Both the leggings and top were a bit too loose. But that made her also look adorable, with her curls spilling on her shoulders, her hands half hidden, and she just looked soft. "You look ready for a slumber party," 𝗬𝗪 said. "You look adorable," 𝗵𝗃 squealed. "I'm jealous. The prince would be blind not to pick you." Both Izuku and 𝗬𝗏 agreed with 𝗵𝗃. He wondered if 𝗬𝗏𝗃 was the kind of woman the prince was looking for. Cute, polite, not too weird. Though she wasn't wealthy, so that might be an issue. But honestly, Izuku had the feeling that unless you were from a wealthy background, the odds wouldn't be in your favor anyway, no matter if you were the whole package. 𝗵𝗃 stretched her arms, yawning widely. "I know it isn't even bedtime yet, but I'm absolutely beaten. Tell me something about it. I thought shopping was exhausting." Uraraka dramatically slumped against 𝗬𝗪, her head in 𝗬𝗪's lap. "This is worse. At least you didn't have to chop the wood." "That's all on Midoriya." "It was impressive," 𝗬𝗏𝗃 chimed in. "I mean, my dad usually does the wood chopping. And he definitely isn't faster than you." "Toru, your dad is at least twice Midoriya's age," 𝗵𝗃 pointed out. "Yes, but we're girls. People don't expect us to be good at manual labor, and sometimes I believe them." "You don't have to be good at manual labor to be awesome," Uraraka said. "My mom works as hard as my dad. Maybe she doesn't do the wood chopping, but she makes sure things look presentable. My dad has no idea how to paint or design anything. My mom makes sure everyone is healthy." Izuku chimed in. "She is our residential healer. She is our only breadwinner, as my father left a long time ago." "Your dad is a dick," 𝗬𝗏𝗃 gasped. "𝗵𝗃, you can't say that. He isn't nice for leaving your mother," 𝗬𝗪 said. "He's a dick, like 𝗵𝗃 said." Izuku couldn't help but giggle. "But that means I'm close to my mother. I absolutely love her. I think she is a bit lonely right now, without me making a mess of the house. I think my parents miss me too," Uraraka admitted. "I miss working in the bakery." 𝗬𝗏𝗃 hiked her knees up to her chest. "It was way less pressure than this. I'm glad to be away from home. My siblings drove me up to the wall." 𝗵𝗃 shot them a cheeky grin. "Not that you lot are a lot better." There were several words of protest. They died out quite quickly as someone knocked on their door. "Yes," 𝗵𝗃 shouted, not attempting to get up. They locked the door from the inside by placing a chair under the doorknob, to avoid being overrun in their sleep. "Is there still space to sleep?" the voice asked. The girl sounded tired and slightly defeated. She must be one of the few that didn't manage to get a bed. The first answer would be no, as 5 people were just right for the amount of sleeping space they had. But none of them actually wanted to deny this person access. Izuku had promised himself a long time ago that he wouldn't be an actual bitch and make the competition hell for everyone. He wouldn't be able to live with that. It would be a bit tight, 𝗬𝗏𝗃 said hesitantly, her gaze fluttering between all 4 of them. "But I think it will fit." "I think it does," 𝗵𝗃 said, more confidently. "Though maybe a name first." Izuku waited nervously, wondering who was knocking on their door. 𝗵𝗃 had a good sense of who to trust and who not to. If the name set alarm bells off with both 𝗵𝗃 and 𝗬𝗏𝗃, their residential ninja squad, they would just keep the door closed. Though the girl could make their night a living hell by just pounding against the door over and over again. That would be fun. Gyro Kyoka. 𝗵𝗃's eyes lit up. "She is cool," she whispered. 𝗬𝗏𝗃 nodded in confirmation. In case it was a trap, and a group of girls tried to get in, Izuku was the one to open the door. He had enough muscles to close the door if necessary. Silently removing the chair, Izuku opened the door. The hallway was entirely abandoned aside from one girl standing in front of them. She had short, dark hair with equally dark eyes. She was a couple of inches shorter than Izuku. Despite wearing a dress, she didn't look overly feminine or girly. Her dress was hot pink with black leggings underneath. She wore a short cropped black jacket over it. "Come in," Izuku whispered, opening the door a bit further so the girl could slip in. Gyro looked around the room with awe. "Wow," she said, carefully settling against the wall. "You guys are amazing at this stuff. You got everything." Her eyes took in the firewood, the leftover food stack, their pile of blankets and candles. "That happens when a group of girls team up," 𝗵𝗃 said brightly from her position on the mattresses. "Especially when the said group have a diverse skill set." "I thought you did clothes and cosmetics," Gyro asked 𝗵𝗃. And 𝗵𝗃 nodded. "I do, yes. But foremost I'm good with people. I know how to get things at an agreeable price." "You would be amazing at poker," 𝗬𝗪 pointed out. 𝗵𝗃 sighed. "Never played poker. My parents didn't let me." Gyro's eyes lit up. "I know how to," she said. "Not that my parents approve, but the music scene is mostly filled with guys. They taught me how to play poker with them to pass the time. If they had a pile of cards available." Izuku was sure that Gyro would have taught them how to play poker. Sadly enough, they hadn't, so all they could do was chat about their homes and how the competition has been for them. "I'm still impressed though," Gyro said as Uraraka tossed another piece of wood on the fire. "How did you even get that much wood?" "Rob a shop. Midoriya is a lumberjack," 𝗬𝗏𝗃 said excitedly, "though more of a lumberjane. But still, she is the one that got us the wood." Uraraka nodded with pride. She cut down a tree in, 5 minutes. It was impressive. Now 𝗎𝗪 looked at him with interest. He hadn't moved away from the door yet. Instead, he had opted to lean against the wall. He wasn't sure why, as it wasn't comfortable and the bed was warmer and softer, and he wouldn't feel so tall, so out of place. "Are you here for the prince?" Mina asked with interest, successfully distracting 𝗎𝗪, deciding that he would attract too much attention by standing. Izuku carefully sat down next to Uraraka and Tsuyu. Uraraka still had her head in Tsuyu's lap, and Tsuyu was petting Uraraka's hair awkwardly. It seemed that neither knew exactly what to do with these feelings, though Izuku couldn't blame them. Shouto still confused him a lot, and Shouto felt a lost cause already. "None of us is either," 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 said, drawing Tsuyu, Uraraka, and Izuku into their conversation. "I mean, I met this guard, and I've talked with him a couple of times. He is really sweet." Mina grinned, high-fiving her friend. "I'm just playing wing woman. I mean, Midoriya here has a ridiculous crush on Shouto." "I have not," Izuku snapped, hating how his cheeks heated up. "He's nice, but I don't know him at all." "Shouto, the guy who took our interviews." All of them nodded. She grimaced. "He was scary." "He isn't too bad," Izuku countered, trying to wave the accusation away. "A bit awkward, but I don't think he has spent much time with women and doesn't know what to do. He's not bad looking." Everyone looked at Tsuyu in surprise. Up until now, Tsuyu had said little to nothing about Shouto or anyone really. "I like boys and girls." One big O came from them. "I just like girls," 𝗎𝗪 and Uraraka confessed at the same time. The two of them looked at each other in surprise. Not interested, 𝗎𝗪 blurted out, "Though you're cute." Uraraka blushed prettily. "You're cool," she admitted. "But there is someone else I like." The girls stared at each other for a bit longer before giggling. "And the rest of us are just boring and like guys," Mina concluded. Izuku wrung his hands together, wondering if he should fess up or not. Since they were all so open about it, he might as well be. "I like both, but I generally prefer guys, especially guys like Shouto." "Not especially," Izuku protested, shooting a glare towards Mina. "I haven't had many courting opportunities yet. It's nice to meet people my ages that are in my dating pool. Midoriya has a sad courting life, you see. That's why we're trying to set her up with Shouto. He is handsome, as Tsuyu pointed out, and he seems to know the prince, so you're probably set for life." "I said he wasn't bad looking," Tsuyu grumbled, but her comment was mostly ignored. "You have been doing a poor job setting me up with Shouto," Izuku pointed out, and when he said it, he realized it was true. Despite all their teasing, nobody had actually tried to set him up with Shouto. "Mina and I are still doing background checks," 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 explained, sounding very serious, "to avoid setting you up with a creep. He does have a secret room," Izuku said without much thinking. All of them stared at him. They were all shocked or surprised, each of them in various degrees. "That sounds really creepy." "Only a little, yes. What even do you put in a secret room?" "What would Shouto put in a secret room?" "Books." Izuku buried his face in his hands. Why did he have to say that? "It's an emergency room," he explained to the girls. "The castle is filled with those hidden doors that lead to a place to hide in case of an emergency. You know, like in the books." Thankfully, the conversation shifted to the fact that there were hidden rooms and passages in the palace, and that Izuku was a jerk for never telling them about it. So till late into the evening, the girls were making plans to roam around the castle, trying to find those secret places. "Maybe there is a secret passage to the kitchens," Uraraka said excitedly. "That would be awesome." Mina groaned. "You're making me hungry." 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 yawned, causing some sort of chain reaction. At some point, they all yawned. "I think it's time for bed," Tsuyu suggested. "We're all tired." Izuku figured they were. He had cut down a tree and chopped up wood for the fireplace. Tsuyu and Uraraka have been carrying buckets of heavy wood up the stairs. Mina and 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 walked to the village and back, dragging groceries along the way back. Tsuyu spent her time in the kitchen cooking for quite some people because of the deals Mina had made. He wasn't sure what 𝗎𝗪 had done during her stay, but surely she had at least acquired some food because she hadn't been hungry. They blew out a few candles and let the fireplace slowly peter out. When the light was bearable enough to sleep in, they spread themselves over the mattresses. Uraraka and Tsuyu laid next to each other, Izuku lying between them on the other side of the mattress, his feet jammed between their torsos. Well, if they wanted they could cuddle with his legs. 𝗎𝗪 laid in the same position as him, her legs sandwiched between 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 and Mina. She looked a tad uncomfortable but clearly put on a brave face for the comfort of a warm bed and pleasant company. Or maybe it was just a warm bed. "Good night," 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 whispered, causing a chain reaction of good nights and sleep well. Surprisingly, despite being uncomfortable and in unfamiliar territory, Izuku fell asleep within a couple of minutes. They were woken by a booming voice coming from downstairs. Izuku wondered who possessed the lungs to make that much ruckus, but then he remembers Yamada, the blonde-haired staff member that played a big role in the competition's organization. The guy had a big set of lungs. "Ladies, please gather downstairs." The voice boomed. Izuku wondered if the man could shake houses with his voice. Is he fucking serious? Uraraka grumbled, burying her head into the pillow. A few muttered agreements followed. Ladies, the same voice boomed. You have 5 minutes to come downstairs, or you're disqualified. Groaning, moaning, and cursing like sailors, the 6 of them got up. Instead of getting his clothes back, too little time for that, Midoriya wrapped himself into a blanket. A few of the girls did the same, snuggling close to the preheated fabric, stepping into his shoes and removing the chair. Izuku got in line with the rest of the girls filing out their bedrooms. Some had blankets wrapped around their arms, others were rubbing their bare arms to keep warm. He chuckled at the girls with a bad case of bed hair, knowing fully well that his own was horrible. His curls probably had gotten a life on its own, which was quite usual after a night of sleep. Did you sleep well? Suyu asked him as they shuffled down the stairs, careful not to trip over the bedsheets. Surprisingly, yes, Izuku yawned. Ew, I hadn't realized how tired I was till I closed my eyes. Me neither. But I am glad we at least got some sleep, even if it was due to exhaustion. Izuku gestured to a girl that walked in front of them. She looked barely awake, her head bobbing while she probably was fighting the sleep that was trying to overtake. Once gathered downstairs, they were greeted by an excited Yamada and a tired-looking Aizawa. At least Aizawa was reflecting their current state of mind. Yamada was way too happy this early. Even the morning people seemed to have given up trying to properly wake up. He doubted any of them had gotten more than a handful of hours of sleep. Good morning, ladies. Yamada spread his arms as if welcoming them all in his home. I hope you had a nice day yesterday. There was a few half-hearted greeting, but nobody replied on Yamada's second comment. A nice day, his ass. Not that any of them looked physically or mentally able to reply. Let's go straight to the point, Aizawa drawled. As most of you have guessed, this was a test. We wanted to see how you act in a high-level stress environment, as the royal life is quite hectic. Yamada picked up where Aizawa left them hanging. Like Aizawa said, this was a test, and you'll be graded based on how you handled the situation. Your score will be based on peer interviews, and the field reports our guards will give us. There are guards, Mina hissed. Where? I haven't seen them. Izuku racked his brain, trying to recall if he had seen anyone familiar, but he hadn't. Didn't you see any on your way to the village? He asked in a whisper. Hagakure and Mina shook their heads. No, well, maybe in the village disguised. It's hard to recognize them out of their uniform, but I haven't seen anyone else hanging around the lodge but us. Sir, this test was ridiculous, one of the girls said. Izuku wasn't sure who she was. She was average of height, with long, lavenderish hair and a cool gaze. The only thing he knew that she was one of the richer ladies here. There are no guards. We could have been attacked, and a queen never leaves without a guard. Additional to that, this test is unfair. Lady Intelli, Yamada said, his smiling not even wavering. Prince Todoroki had shown a desire for a wife who is capable of handling situations herself. And you weren't alone here. 17 other girls could have helped you out. I don't see how it's unfair, as everyone was unaware that this was happening. Also, we didn't leave you unprotected, they just stayed out of sight. A few of you ladies were getting awfully close to actually discovering them. Yamada shot a smile Izuku's way. Clearly, the men had hidden somewhere in the forest, well enough to remain hidden, but close enough to keep an eye on them. Transport will arrive soon, Yamada continued. Get dressed, clean yourself, eat something if there is food left. A full breakfast will be ready once you lot arrived at the palace, so that's something to get you motivated. There were little signs of relief, and Izuku was sure that he heard Uraraka's stomach growl. Looking at the steadily growing blush on her cheeks, Izuku's suspicion had been confirmed. Do you think we can bring the blankets along? Mina asked as they trudged up the stairs. My shoulders are a bit cold. I'm going to try anyway, Izuku replied. His legs were slowly losing all feeling in them, but he couldn't just ask Hagakure to return his leggings. Her dress was still dirty and would be awfully unpleasant to wear. My legs are freezing. They did get away with stealing some of the blankets. Well, he and Mina did. They had been fortunate enough that only Yamada had seen them sneaking away with the blankets, and 2 pairs of sad eyes were enough to convince the guy to let them take the blankets. The ride back was way more pleasant. The curtains were open, the sun was shining, and they were all huddling together underneath the blankets. Half of them, Izuku included, had been rocked to sleep by the time they had arrived back at the palace. The coachman sniggered and had reluctantly woken them up. After kicking them out of the carriage, the group trudged towards the palace. Your hair is a mess, Mina pointed out. As if yours isn't. Izuku couldn't help but laugh. Everybody looked a little off. Future queens usually didn't walk around with messy curls, or with their heels in their hand, blankets draped around their shoulders, or carrying around a muddy dress. Not that the other girls looked all that well put together. There were a few that had managed to get their dress wrinkle-free, their hair untangled, and their faces clean. However, most of them looked like they had slept in their dress and hadn't bothered to change, which was the truth. It wasn't like they could have changed. None of them had brought along an extra set of clothes. They were welcomed by a few staff members that ushered them towards the dining hall where their breakfast would be served. A few of the guards gave them a double take, probably not sure if their eyes were deceiving them or not. Izuku spotted Shouto and called out to him, waving frantically. He was happy to see a familiar face, making sure that this wasn't a fever dream. Shouto whirled around, surprise written all over his face. Hadn't he known about the test? Or hadn't he expected Izuku to call out to him? They hadn't spoken that much, but Izuku felt like they were somewhat close. Shouto waved back but didn't bother to catch up with him. Izuku was slightly hurt, but on the other hand, Shouto most likely had his own thing to do. The staff wasn't paid for lounging around, though Shouto seemed to have a lot of free time. He was totally flustered. Mina giggled. I mean, you show off quite some leg. He did. Yes, you do, uraraka said with a big smile on her face. I mean, guys go weak if they see knees. It's too much for them. Tsuyu snorted loudly. Knees? They're just knees. Yeah, but you don't get it. Guys can't resist them. Mina wiggled her eyebrows. They all started to laugh, uraraka even going as far as to cry a little. He was quite sure that the maid who was escorting them was giggling, though she at least tried to hide it. Izuku doubted that it was Izuku's knees that caught Shouto off guard. Izuku figured that Shouto just wasn't the best with people in general, and their group made an interesting picture. Or maybe on a sadder note, Shouto had been embarrassed to be associated with such a disheveled-looking group of women. Shouto probably had spent most of his life being surrounded by either staff or important ladies. Seeing a bunch of unkempt commoners must be a rare sight within the palace walls. Izuku wasn't hiding, because he wasn't avoiding his friends. He just needed some breathing space after spending too much time in close company with so many people. Back home, there weren't that many people in one place, especially not that many people who were running on stress and adrenaline. It was exhausting, so he had retreated to the library, dragging a chair to some empty, quiet corner and picked up a book. He probably managed to read 2 pages before dozing off. He was woken up by a guard somewhere mid-afternoon. His hair was sticking to his face, the book lying on the ground. You're okay? The knight asked. Izuku nodded, rubbing the sleep out of eyes and stifled a yawn. Just tired, he added, though he was sure it wasn't needed. The knight most likely knew about the test, especially as it already had happened. In the palace, words traveled faster than the howling wind, managing to shake himself awake. Even just a little, Izuku took in the knight. To his surprise, he was around Izuku's age, maybe a bit older, with short, bluish-black hair, piercing red eyes framed by glasses. He was broad, though his height made him look slimmer. Sorry for waking you up, but you were summoned. Dread settled deep in his bones, lips struggling to form words. He was going to get eliminated, wasn't he? Unless Shouto wanted to see him, but Shouto would have come himself and not send a guard. Did he even have enough authority to order a knight to do his biddings? Don't be frightened, Lady Midoriya. The knight moved his arms around in chopping motions. You aren't eliminated, not as far as I'm aware. You did well during the test. How did this knight know his name? He wasn't one of the more memorable ladies, looking quite plain, and he wasn't from a wealthy background either. Unless this was an important knight, an important part of the competition and familiar with what was going on. Considering he had mentioned Izuku had done well during the test, he had to play some part in the contest. Maybe he was one of the knights on guard duty, having to keep them safe and checking on the process. Izuku got up from his chair, placing the book back on the shelf. He hadn't absorbed a single word from it. Admittedly, he just had plucked something from the shelf, not even aware of what the book was about. Are you supposed to escort me? Or am I to go alone? Izuku winced at his choice of words. He supposed it sounded polite, but they felt weird on his tongue. I will escort you, the knight said. Aizawa is well aware how easily you can get lost here. Still filled with dread. No matter what the knight had promised him, Izuku left his cozy reading corner and followed the knight through the many corridors, passing places in the palace he hadn't seen before. The knight kept up a constant chatter, but little was actually discussed. The man mostly spoke about his family, a bit about himself, what kind of work it was, being a knight. Weeks ago, Izuku would have been excited. He always wanted to be a knight, but now, he couldn't care less. He wanted to stay here, as there still was a lot to be gained here. And he didn't even care about the competition itself. It was about the friends he made and the wonderful time he had. Here we are, the knight announced, stopping at a plain-looking door. The rest of your friends are here already, I think. It was hard to track you all down, as you're normally in each other's presence. Izuku laughed awkwardly, offering the knight a polite nod and knocked on the door. Seconds later, a 𝗵𝗃 granted him entrance. He was willing to put a lot of money on that it was Aizawa, the lazy drawl slowly getting familiar. Entering the room, Izuku was relieved that the knight was right. Tsuyu, uraraka, Mina and Hagakure were all present. Like Izuku, they all had bathed and changed, looking like proper ladies again instead of a crew of commoners. Izuku preferred them all looking a little rumpled, a little bit wild, but that simply wasn't the nature of the competition. He noticed that the knight slipped in after him, yet nobody batted an eye at him. The rest of the room was occupied by Aizawa, Yamada, and Kayama. Izuku had figured that those three were the ones that were in charge of the contest. Seeing as everyone is here, we can start this, Aizawa said. Meeting, let's call it a meeting, Yamada piped in. And don't worry, none of you will be sent home. While the nameless knight had already told Izuku, he was relieved to hear that it was actually true. Then why are we here? Tsuyu asked. Because if it had been up to me, you would have been sent home, Aizawa said. Why? Mina cried out, arms flailing a little. We didn't break any rules, did we? Not as far as I know, but I've got the feeling you had someone on the inside telling you things. I told you I didn't tell them anything, Yamada protested. I'm not an idiot. Aizawa waved off Yamada's outcry. Disputable. I'm curious, how did you know that this was a test and not just an outing? The coachman told us see you tomorrow. I mean, usually an outing doesn't include an overnight stay. Kaminari sighed. Shouldn't have sent that kid. Before Izuku could ask who Kaminari was, Aizawa continued. And based off that you figured that it was a test. Aizawa looked at Mina with an unimpressed look. It was me, Izuku said. At least, I assumed that something was off. There were no tracks around the house, aside from the ones that our carriage left. It had been a while since someone had been there. There was no filled water basin for the horses. Upstairs the curtains were closed, which blocks out all the light. If people lived there, the curtains wouldn't have been closed. Midoriya is our residential strategist, Mina said proudly. More like the residential paranoid mess, Izuku's mind added. Yamada's eyes shone with excitement. How did you find the key? Uraraka raised her hand, a blush staining her cheeks red. My parents hide our key between the slats of our house. It requires 2 people to get, so it isn't a quick grab and break in. So I guess that this might be the same case. Out of sight, avoiding break-ins, but as the owner, you still can get in. Yamada nodded. And why did you guys decide to work together? We decided to work together because we're friends, and putting our heads together gave us an advantage over others, Mina said. Sir, Hagakure added, shooting Mina a nervous glance. But I agree with what Mina said. Aizawa, you seriously wanted to eliminate this lot. Why? Kayama grin was almost feline. Because they're more trouble than they're worth, which means they're doing great. Yamada gave them 2 thumbs up. The results will be announced after dinner, but you can assume you will be staying here for a while longer. Just don't tell the others. You're free to leave. The knight opened the door for them, and they left the room in a hurry. Once outside, with the door closed, everyone let out a sigh of relief. Izuku couldn't believe that Aizawa actually thought they had cheated. It wasn't like they were the favorites to win anyway. I feel like I aged 10 years in the last 2 days. Ditto. Same. This contest is killing me. This contest has killed me. They burst out in giggles. It was hard to believe that maybe one of them would be the next princess. Despite that they looked the part, he wasn't quite sure if anyone fitted the role as queen. At least, he supposed that queens weren't supposed to be moaning and groaning about something, and be laughing about it afterwards. On the other hand, he would trust this country in the hands of these girls more than in any other person's. Admittedly, he was biased. Shouto, so, I heard something. As he basically grew up with Tenya, Shouto knew that this greeting could mean 2 things. Either he had heard some scandalous gossip and had to share it with Shouto just to keep him in the loop, or it was gossip about Shouto. Since the contest started, which was 9 days ago, the gossip mainly had been about Shouto and which girl he wanted to pick. Abandoning his paperwork, it could wait for, well, forever. Shouto braced himself for whatever rumor had reared its ugly head. How bad is it? Tenya sat down on a comfortable chair, making himself comfortable while not giving anything away. Tenya was a pro in that, keeping his face a blank canvas. The rumor is going around that you're weak for knees. He what? I'm quite sure that the ladies started the rumor themselves. But in all seriousness, did you actually bolt away when Lady Midoriya greeted you? It wasn't the knees. Who even likes knees? Shouto hadn't even looked at Midoriya's knees. Her legs, yes. It turned out that freckles were his weakness, or specifically freckles on Midoriya. Tenya looked way too polite for the amount of shit he was sprouting. Shouto wondered if he could find a new best friend. He doubted it. So it was the legs, partially, and the hair. She just looked. Shouto wasn't sure what it was feeling. Izuku generally made him feel comfortable. Her expressions were charming, and she talked about literally anything, and didn't mind that Shouto barely talked. She just saw Shouto as Shouto, and honestly, that's all that he asked for. Someone by his side who just like him for him, though he was afraid he would never return those feelings romantically. Sexy? Heavens no, I like guys. Tenya laughed, his eyes crinkling with joy. I know that. I think you're thinking about domestic. Just awake, dressed comfortably. Hair a mess. Oh, that sounded just right. He liked seeing Midoriya like that, homely and not all dressed up, looking pretty. She was quite pretty, but Shouto held little value to female beauty. He hadn't considered that his heart rate had picked up because Midoriya reminded him of what he wanted to call home. To softness, the unapologetic I just woke up look. You seem to know a lot about this, Shouto said, trying to steer the conversation into another direction. He was glad he had a friend like Tenya because he had no idea how he was ever going to survive this contest otherwise. There were so many candidates, and all of them had something about them. Only Midoriya had the most something about her. The thing that caught Shouto's attention. Or maybe Shouto was just weak for the freckles. He hadn't expected Tenya to grow flustered, wringing his hands together as if he was considering confession something. Well, that's because I've been seeing someone. What? Wait, you're seeing someone? I thought it was a work in progress. Tenya nodded. How hadn't Shouto noticed this? Tenya was his closest friend, and yet he hadn't known that he was in a courtship. Tenya knew basically everything about Shouto's love life, no matter how small the detail was. Of course, Tenya had hinted at it before, but he had sounded so uncertain that Shouto had figured it was a fleeting thing. Who is it? Tenya shook his head. I can't tell you. We've decided to keep it a secret. Shouto couldn't help but feel hurt. Shouto told Tenya basically everything, so why shouldn't Tenya trust him with this? You as no other should know how important it is to keep it a secret. It took Shouto way too long to realize that this was a hint, not necessarily on whoever was Tenya's partner, but about the issues they were facing. You're seeing a guy. Tenya nodded. He had never known that Tenya was interested in guys. Admittedly, it wasn't a subject either of them discussed a lot. With Tenya expected to the next big era, following his brother's footsteps to become at least head of the guards, and Shouto expected to marry a woman and become king, there wasn't a lot of space for fairy tale love. After a long silence, in which Shouto tried to focus on his paperwork, Tenya spoke up. So, have you made your decision? Wife or elimination? Elimination. Though I wouldn't mind hearing who you picked as your bride. Shouto sighed, digging through the massive paperwork to find his notes. I feel like my judgment is unfair because I wasn't there. But I was, Tenya piped in. And you can always use me to reflect on your choices. Well, Lady Midoriya, uraraka, Asui, Ashido, and Hagakure were by far the best. They show teamwork, clever thinking, and utilized their skill sets. Momo and Lady Kendo also did well. The others that definitely passed were Ladies Shizaki, Kodai, and Tsunotori. I agree with you. I think that those ladies were the best in handling the situation, improvising on the spot, and they relied on each other. Though Lady Hato and Nakagame both did well. They did rely a little too much on the others, but that's fine. Shouto nodded, marking the names of the ladies that would be staying. They had agreed on 12 of them, which left them with 6 maybes or definite no's. Lady Intelli passed the test on paper, but her behavior was less than pleasant. But she is one of my father's favorites. So even if I tried to eliminate her, he would save her. Tenya nodded somberly. Yes, I fear so. The king will try everything to keep Group 3 as big as possible. If Shouto recalled correctly, Group 3 was the one Momo belonged to, together with the other well-off girls. He had been told by Aizawa that it was likely that he would be marrying one of these girls, as they were his father's pick. The rest was all chosen at random and put in the other groups, so we're eliminating 5. Tenya suggested when Shouto refused to pick up the slack. That isn't too bad. Looking at his notes, Shouto saw that there was still one lady he wanted to keep around for a while longer. She might have relied on the kindness of others, but she passed on paper. And if Lady Intelli was allowed to stay, she might as well. Lady Gyro will be staying too, so just 4 girls. Tenya looked taken aback with his comment. Really, 4 contestants aren't a lot. No, not compared how many girls originally would have left after this elimination. But I think the next one will send quite a few packing. Tenya's groan was exactly what Shouto was feeling about the next elimination round. The winter ball, in celebration of the start of winter and his mother's birthday. There would be many people, all high-ranked snobs. Shouto hated these events, and now the contestants had to suffer through the same thing. Girls like Momo and Kendo would be in their element, but he knew that a majority of them would struggle. Because military training was one thing, surviving days surrounded by snobby, rich folk, looking pristine and learn manners in a matter of hours was a whole new level of a challenge. Shouto wasn't looking forward to the preparations. Not only did that mean he was busy, which sucked on its own, but he wouldn't get the opportunity to figure out the feelings surrounding Midoriya. Was she someone he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, even without having romantic feelings for her? Momo was the safest choice, but he never had found comfort in her presence that he had with Midoriya. Their conversations were generally limited to politics or their half-arranged marriage. They were too similar, but Midoriya made him feel warm, and according to Tenya, at home. Life wouldn't be boring with her if he ever dared to rob her of her freedom. Because once they got married, she was stuck in this palace, having to live in a golden cage with little hope to ever leaving. Was he selfish enough to demand that from her? I fucking hate this contest. Language. It was weird to think that they were almost halfway through the competition. They had started out with 24 girls, and on day 12, there were only 14 left. Admittedly, he had expected that only 12 girls had remained after the second test, which was basically a training exercise for knights. But instead of 6 girls leaving, only 4 left. 4 girls from 𝗎𝗫's group of candidates. The only good part about that was that 𝗎𝗫 only had to share the bathroom with only one other girl. But aside from that, it suddenly had gotten rather lonely, as the girls you were grouped with were the ones you saw the most. Dinner was filled with chatter. As there were only 14 girls left, it was a bit easier to get to know each other, especially as Izuku knew more than half of them already. The people who he wasn't quite familiar with were 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗬, a blonde girl Tsuyunu, Tsunotori, another blonde that was the last of 𝗎𝗫's group. Then there were the elite girls. Not all of them acted like it, but they had that air about them. Izuku was sure that they were the real contenders here, and the rest was there to act as the supporting cast. That was fine with him. He had no desire to marry the prince anyway. Their dinner was interrupted by the arrival of 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Before the door was even opened to reveal her, they had heard the clicking of her heels. Stone floors were really noisy, especially as most of the women here wore heels. Swinging open the door, she made her grand entrance, grinning from ear to ear. As they were left alone most of the time, Izuku feared that they had decided on a new test. Looking at the timeline, it would be a bit early. Only 5 days had passed. On the other hand, maybe they decided that 6 days was too long between challenges. The contest averaged around a month, based on past results. Statistically, before day 15, they had to be down to at least half of the crew, which meant 2 more girls had to be sent home within 3 days. Don't look like I'm the bringer of bad news, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 chided, taking the position at the head of the table. It's not a test. You won't be stuck in a lodge for another night. Izuku saw a few girls deflate with relief. While the experience hadn't been traumatizing per se, it had shown the faults this test had. None of them were soldiers. None of them had trained for survival. If this had been their first test, before anyone knew anyone, the results might have been disastrous. Now they just succeeded by banding together and making the best of the skills they did have. I'm here to announce that in a week's time, the Winter Ball takes place, in honor of the Queen's birthday and the start of winter. Multiple people shared confused looks, Izuku included. They celebrated the start of winter. Nobody in his village was happy with the winter. It was cold. Their homes weren't equipped for the cold, and most of the work came to a sudden halt. The farmers did have some vegetables to grow, like carrots, onions, and turnips, but they weren't corn, wheat, and other products used to make bread. Nor did most of the cattle appreciate the cold. Cows couldn't roam around freely, having to be locked up to keep warm. Though it wasn't just the animals who couldn't spend a lot of time outside. It was hard to work outside when there were 2 inches of snow surrounding you, crunching underneath your feet and sending chills up your body as your boots got soaked. Winter sucked. Have you ever been happy about winter? Uraraka asked in a whisper, leaning close so that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 wouldn't notice. Izuku shook his head. Ever tried to cut a tree when it's freezing? It isn't fun. My parents have close to no jobs during the winter, 𝗬𝗫 piped in. The sea is at risk of freezing, so very few ships leave port. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 clapped her hands together, demanding their attention once again. As you ladies are guests here, you're expected to attend the ball. Our team will help you with getting dresses. There are a few things that you should keep in mind. Firstly, there will be guests coming from far and wide, so some of them will arrive early. Be polite to them and answer the questions they ask. You aren't allowed to stay in your room the entire day, as the guests would like to see who could be their future queen. Secondly, Prince Todoroki won't be attending the ball. He's busy with work out of the kingdom, and won't return anytime soon. Thirdly, during the ball, you aren't allowed to refuse anyone's request for a dance. Aside from those rules, just remember to remain classy and try to leave a good impression, as the people you will meet might be important friends in your futures. Izuku hated to think it, but being stuck in a lodge sounded more appealing than this. A ball, in which they had to socialize with rich arses, and dance, and wearing big, sparkly dresses. Not to mention heels. Izuku probably had to learn how to walk on heels, in a time frame of a week. To his surprise, he was one of the few who wasn't excited. Mina's eyes were shining, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗬 was smiling, and uraraka was bouncing in her seat. Maybe it was a guy thing. Looking around, he saw that everyone looked excited in one way or form. It probably was a guy thing. He supposed that dancing the night away was romantic if you had a partner. But the idea of dancing with someone did compensate for the heavy dress he probably had to wear, the heels, and having to share a space with way too many people. Not to mention he didn't know how to dance. However, it was still a week away. By then, the others' excitement probably had gotten to him. After all, he wouldn't mind dancing with one of his friends, or with Shouto for that matter. If, of course, Shouto even wanted to dance with him. Was he supposed to take a date to this thing? Maybe he could ask one of his friends to be his date so that they didn't have to dance with creepy old men. By the next day, Izuku had made peace with the winter ball. It seemed fun, a good time, and he could feel pretty for once in his life. However, being the idiot he was, he had forgotten one big detail. The dress. Just after breakfast, Izuku's group was pulled aside by 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗏. She was an elderly lady, with a kind face and her hair cropped short. It wasn't really ladylike, but it made her look distinct and a lot younger. She ushered them to her office and let them settle on a big, deep couch before taking place behind her desk. "Have you ladies thought of a dress design already?" she asked, shuffling through her papers. "We're pretty short on time, so we would like to lock in all the designs and measurements today." Measurements? Oh no. Measurements would mean that he had to get at least half naked in front of a complete stranger, naked enough to notice his gender, and that it was the wrong gender for this contest. He would get kicked out at best, arrested and executed in the worst case, and only for a dress he would wear once. "I don't need one," Izuku blurted out. "I have one packed. I don't want to make the workload even bigger for the staff here." The 𝗵𝘃𝗲 looked surprised, staring at Izuku for a long while. "Lady Midoriya, right?" Izuku nodded. "Know that we don't mind, especially for you lot." She gestured in their general direction. "We always like an underdog story, and it seems that you're a serious candidate for the crown." All eyes settled on Izuku. "Me?" The 𝗵𝘃𝗲 nodded. "Yes, you, young lady. We hear a lot of gossips. Don't you want to impress during the ball?" "Did he?" "Not necessarily. He never liked to be the center of attention, especially amongst so many people that would be criticizing him. All the rich folk didn't want a commoner on the throne. That would be a disadvantage to them. At least, he expected them to think like that, just like the commoners didn't want another privileged lady on the throne that had to worry about the basic things like food and having a weather-tight shelter. "My own dress will suffice," Izuku said stubbornly. "Thank you for the offer, but it doesn't feel right to request a new dress if I have one that works." Thankfully, the 𝗵𝘃𝗲 decided that she let Izuku have his way and moved on to the other girls. Uraraka wanted a knee-length dress with a 𝗵𝘃𝗲 skirt in a soft pink color. Both Mina and 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 went with a floor-length dress, but the shape was quite different. 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 went with a tight top and a long, flowy skirt in a bright yellow color. Mina opted for a longer top that hugged her figure a bit and flared out after the hips. She wanted to go with a sky blue number. Izuku had no idea what any of those dressed would look like beyond the description the girls had given, but the 𝗵𝘃𝗲 clearly knew what his friends were talking about. The only thing he figured was that the dresses were colorful. He had assumed that going blue and white fitted the theme of the winter ball better, but at least his friend either didn't get the memo or didn't care. Thankfully, that would mean that his green-colored dress wouldn't stand out too much. It probably would even fade to the background, as it wasn't as vibrant or elaborated as the dresses the rich could afford. After all, who wanted to dance with him when there was Uraraka with her bright smiles and bubbly personality, Mina with her confidence and natural charisma, and 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 with her sweet smiles and sweet personality? After 2 days, Izuku realized that no way he could use in one of his hand-me-down dresses for the winter ball. They were fine for day-to-day life, but he would stand out like a sore thumb among all the pretty dresses, the bling, the rich fabrics. He would be sent home for just being a disgrace to the competition. The issue was, he wasn't ready to blow his cover, at least not to a staff member. No matter how kind and friendly they looked, they could tell Izuku's secret without ever really feeling guilty about it. And once it reached the king's ears, he would be removed from the competition, and it wouldn't be pretty. He had wondered if he should tell Shouto, but that was a definite no. He was too close to this contest, too biased. He was the prince's replacement. He would send Izuku home without pardon. While the likes of Aizawa and Yamato were an option, he didn't feel comfortable sharing that with them, especially since Aizawa wasn't particularly fond of him. This left him the girls he had met just 2 weeks ago. But he cared deeply for them, and he trusted them a lot. They put a lot of trust in each other, to begin with, sharing secrets that could have them eliminated from the competition. Maybe it would ruin their friendship, but if that was the case, he wasn't sure if they were actually his friends. He had a reason to be here, and he hadn't misused his gender for inappropriate things. That had been a definite no-no from the very beginning. Finally leaving his room, he walked over to Uraraka's room that was next to his. He wasn't sure if she was there, but seeing as they all had been sleeping in as much as possible, he knew that it was a possibility. Otherwise, he had to wander around the palace in the hope to stumble upon her. Knocking on the door, Izuku felt relief when he heard a muffled what. It seemed that she just had woken up, but available. "It's Midoriya, can I come in?" A half-formed yes followed, and Izuku entered Uraraka's bedroom. It might have taken a while, but after 2 weeks, it had started looked homely. Clothes were thrown on the floor, letters scattered across the desk, and drawing, pictures and paintings were hung on the walls. "What's so important that you leave your bed early?" Uraraka asked, her voice rough with sleep, carefully sitting down on Uraraka's bed. Not caring much that she was still half buried underneath her blankets, Izuku tried to word his predicament, which wasn't exactly easy as he didn't want to mention that he was a guy. He probably had to, but there was this sliver of hope he hadn't to, and everything would remain the same. "I don't have a dress," Izuku confessed. "For the winter ball, I mean." Uraraka sighed deeply. "I guessed that already, but why didn't you accept her offer and let one be made?" "Measuring? What about measuring? I would have to undress." Uraraka started owlishly at him. "You said you grew up surrounded by girls." "I did." "Then why are you uncomfortable being half-dressed in front of them?" "You don't have to be naked in front of the seamstress. Your underwear will do just fine." Well, there went his only excuse. Because I'm a guy. What? Guy? I'm a guy. Izuku paused, feeling reality set in. Now this feels uncomfortable. Uraraka giggled. Can I say I'm not surprised? You aren't. Izuku felt a little relieved. Not only wasn't Uraraka really surprised, she hadn't kicked him out of her room yet. You sound a little boyish, Uraraka explained between her giggles. And you have a boyish build, and sometimes you don't know what to do when it comes to being a girl. Do you remember when we talked about menstruation? You looked puzzled and a little horrified. Izuku winced at the mention of that conversation. He had felt terrified during the conversation. He had never realized how bad menstruation was, as his mother never talked about it. He only had heard it from the girls in his village, who sometimes moaned and groaned about it. But none of them had described it in the details his friends had. What are you going to do about it? About what? The dress situation, of course. Uraraka finally wiggled free from her blanket prison. You know what? I'm summoning the rest. 5 heads are better than 2, and it isn't like they weren't suspecting anything either. Wearing only a nightgown, Uraraka stepped into her slippers and threw the door open. Sunlight streamed into the room, illuminating her. Izuku was left baffled. He hadn't expected Uraraka to be so calm about it all. But he supposed that this whole competition made you realize that you had to run with whatever you had. Are you coming? Uraraka looked straight at him, her eyes bright with excitement. I'm not going to clean up your mess. That's up to you. Uraraka had called in an emergency meeting in their bathroom. It was a weird place to have a heart-to-heart, or whatever this is, but Uraraka argued that this place had the best noise-canceling walls. The other 3 looked curious, and surprisingly, calmly listened to Izuku's story. He spent most time explaining why he was here. He assumed that the dressed as a girl part was pretty obvious. But your name is Midoriya, right? Izuku nodded. Midoriya Izuku. Midoriya Haruka is my cousin, from my mother's side. You make a pretty convincing girl, Tsuyu said. It's a bit unfair, Mina said, faking a pout. You look cute as a girl and as a guy. He wanted to point out that he didn't look cute as a guy, but his face told otherwise. His cheeks were too pinchable, the freckles, the big, green eyes, and his messy, green hair. He should cut his short, after the contest of course. I wonder why you're telling us now. I mean, I'm happy you told us. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 clasped her hands together. But I would have kept it secret forever. Well, Izuku looked at Uraraka for support, but she just gave him a blank look. No support from her. I don't have a dress. Mina's eyes lit up. That's why you told us. Because you're a guy. You couldn't let the staff make you a dress, because they would figure out your gender. Izuku nodded. I would love to do it, Mina continued, her voice filled with excitement. I mean, you're my friend. But also, many people would see the dress. It's good for business. He was slightly hurt by the idea that Mina would use the opportunity to promote her and her family, but he quickly pushed that feeling away. It was a perfectly acceptable reason. Mina's family's living came from making clothes, doing hair and makeup. Having a dress made by one of their family members exposed to so many people, rich people, could positively influence their family business. Though he wasn't sure if he was the right person to wear such a dress. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 might be better because she was more likable. Or maybe Mina could make a dress for the richer people, who would gather a lot more attention than any of them by default. Are you sure you want the dress to be associated with me? You're one of the contest's favorite, Mana pointed out. And you're my friend. If someone wins the thing, I want it to be one of you guys. Also, imagine Shouto's reaction. You'll render him speechless. Izuku felt nervous by the idea that Mina was going to make him a showstopper dress. He wants to blend in with the rest. But on the other hand, Mina would be making the dress for free. He couldn't tell her to make a boring, simple dress as if he was paying her a fortune for it. Additionally, a simple dress fitted Izuku's wishes better, but it didn't allow Mina to let her skills shine. It will take a lot of time, Izuku blurted out, feeling his cheeks heat up. I don't want you to waste your free time on a dress you make, for me. Mina didn't look put off at all. She looked ready to take on the world. Or at least Izuku's princess dress. It mostly depends on what I can use, she explained. If I can use the sewing workshop and their fabrics, I would be golden. But I'm not sure if I would be allowed to. They don't seem too keen to let us near their workshop. I will ask Shouto, Izuku suggested, knowing that Shouto could get a lot of shit done in the palace by just asking. Uraraka suddenly perked up, finally joining the conversation, only to change the topic completely. Do you even like Shouto? Uraraka asked, or was it all for your cover? She didn't sound accusatory, just slightly worried and curious. I'm not sure, Izuku confessed. I don't dislike him, and I do like both boys and girls, and Shouto is cute. But the contest makes it hard to figure out if the feelings are genuine or they're there for the contest. Cute? Izuku shrugged helplessly. Yes, cute. I mean, he isn't bad looking. He's mostly endearing, and we have the same interests. He's the only one who even knows All Might. As to prove his point, he got several puzzled looks. It wasn't surprising. All Might was mostly known around the big cities, close to the palace. None of them was born around there, nor had grown up around those parts. Izuku only knew about All Might because of the books he read, and he doubted that the rest was quite as interested in reading about the kingdom's history as he was. Actually, he doubted that many of them picked up a book for fun. The next step in their feeble plan was that he had to find Shouto and ask him if Mina could use their sewing workshop. Shouto probably would comply, though he was slightly worried about. Izuku had spent more time wandering around the palace than he would like to admit. The thing was huge, and Shouto had disappeared off the face of the earth. Of course, he had his own things to do, but Izuku had run into Yamada 3 times, all in completely different places. Shouto's complete disappearance was odd, or Shouto was awfully good at hiding. This left him to shout Shouto's name the moment he spotted him, startling everyone within earshot. Servants stared at him with a mix of surprise and disdain. Yamada. This was the 4th time today he saw Yamada, was muffling his laughter, and Shouto had dropped the papers he was holding, his cheeks stained red. Hurrying over to Shouto, Izuku helped him collection the papers while apologizing profusely. He was glad none of the guests had arrived yet, as they must have disapproved of Izuku's actions big time. Yelling at a servant, making a ruckus, blubbering and babbling while clumsily gathering top-secret papers. "It's fine," Shouto said, hugging the papers close to his chest and staring straight at the wall, not even bothering to make eye contact. "You don't have to apologize." Swallowing his apology, Izuku reminded himself why he was even looking for Shouto in the first place. "To ask for a favor. A friend of mine wants to use the sewing workshop, but I'm not sure if contestants are allowed to." Shouto looked surprised by Izuku's question. Wait, was it even a question? He really should have rehearsed this. "Friend? Mina." Shouto now looked confused. "Ashido, I can't believe you know all the contestants by full name. You're the prince's replacement." Izuku teased, and Shouto grew a little flustered. "The one with pink hair," Shouto concluded. "She's hard to miss." Honestly, any of them were all hard to miss. Izuku had noticed that there were a few ladies their age in the castle, especially wearing bright dress. There was Princess Fumi, of course, and a few younger girls. But the rest was mostly the staff, who was wearing a uniform. "But can she use it?" Izuku asked, trying not to sound too hopeful. "I'll have to ask." "Thank you." Izuku bowed quickly before bidding Shouto goodbye. Shouto's relief to see him gone was hard to forget. Clearly, Shouto hadn't been happy to see Izuku, which hurt a little. After dinner, Shouto told him that Mina was free to use the sewing workshop, as long as she cleaned her own mess and didn't bother the seamstresses. Izuku knew that this was important, but he couldn't help but squirm when Mina was taking his measurements. Her hands were cold, the tape tickled, and he felt naked. "I'm allowed to say that this is awkward." Mina snorted, jabbing Izuku in the rib. "You're wearing underwear, and I don't care how you look. I've seen both uglier and more handsome guys in the same state of undress." He couldn't help but be curious. Was she talking about past relationships or work? Work, Mina confirmed. "I haven't been seriously courted before, you know. None of us has been. We're truly an odd bunch. Most of my peers at home are either engaged or married by now." Mina finally moved away, noting down a few measurements while muttering under her breath about things Izuku had no knowledge of. His mother had never shared how she made clothes, and Izuku never had shown interest. Maybe it was time to do that, if only to learn how to fix holes in his clothes. "Couldn't I at least wear a shirt?" Mina sighed deeply. "Give me something to look at, please. You realize you aren't bad looking, right?" Izuku blinked. "Ridiculous. You're absolutely ridiculous." Mina picked up the measuring tape again. "Now, stop fidgeting and let me check. I feel like I got a few measurements wrong." Izuku groaned. "Really?" Mina grinned. "Yes, you big baby, and don't think that this will be the last time." It probably was the first time Shouto had sought him out, instead of vice versa. Izuku was slightly creeped out when Shouto came knocking on his bedroom door, way too early in the morning. Half asleep, with a robe slung over his shoulders to keep warm, Izuku had opened the door, blinking at a frantic-looking Shouto. Shouto wasn't even dressed yet, still wearing crinkled cotton pants and a thick sweater. His hair was messy, long strands of white and red all tangled together. "I don't think guys are allowed here," Izuku said, at least wanting to address the slightly creepy factor. Shouto turned a dark shade of red, burying his face into his hands. After a long minute, he shook his head, sighed, and squared his shoulders. He finally looked back at Izuku. "I told 𝗬𝗄𝗃 I would be here," he explained, "and I just wanted to catch you before breakfast." Leaning against the doorframe, Izuku's mind tried to figure out why Shouto wanted to speak with him before breakfast. Had Mina made a mess of the sewing workshop? Unlikely, as it didn't require catching Izuku this early. In the end, all he could think of was that Shouto wanted to sneak off with him to heavens knows where. But that would be unlikely, as he told 𝗬𝗄𝗃 that he would be up there. At least, that was what he said. "Why?" Shouto fidgeted. He looked miserable, as if he didn't want to be here. "Do you have any plans for today?" Shouto ended up asking, licking his lips, remembering his schedule, which was dodging the arrival nobles the best he could. Izuku shook his head. If Shouto had something planned that would have him excused from any socializing, he would take it. Is there anything you want to do? Izuku shrugged. Not necessarily. Why? I'm avoiding work. That was a feeling Izuku knew. While he didn't mind working hard, sometimes he just wanted to kick back and relax. At least have nobody nagging about things he still needed to do. Okay, let me think of something. It took Izuku a while to figure out what kind of thing he would like to do with Shouto. They could go out to explore the city, something he still wanted to do, but the weather hadn't been in their favor for days. Not ideal for strolling down the streets. He could visit the library on his own, explore his castle with his friends. Was there anything he couldn't do with his friends? Most of them were preparing for the winter ball in one way or form. Nina was spending a lot of time in the sewing workshop while 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗧 was keeping her company. Tsuyu and uraraka had plans together, and originally Izuku was planning on third wheeling just to do something. But now he had Shouto to keep him company, but with what? Maybe he could also do some preparations, like getting his hair done, learn table manners, dancing. Can you dance? Izuku asked with newfound excitement. Shouto nodded slowly, his face showing how unsure he felt. Can you teach me how to ballroom dance? Now Shouto was gaping at him. It took a few seconds for Shouto to react. Nodding slowly, lips still parted in surprise. After Shouto had left to get dressed and have breakfast, Izuku realized he would have one-on-one dance lessons with Shouto. He wasn't going to tell his friends that. They would have a field day with that. The rumors would fly faster than the speed of sound. Shouto was listening wearily as 𝗵𝗲 went over his schedule today. There were so many people arriving. They were all important, and all required him to greet him, have small talk with them, and seem pleasant. Shouto wasn't good at being pleasant. His sister Fumi was much better suited for that job. Shouto was good at being awkward, trying to say the right thing, and end up saying something completely else. Not that it stopped the ladies for coddling him, saying that he had grown into such a lovely young man that surely would break many hearts of the contestants. He was really looking forward to that. Actually, I'm scheduled for the morning, Shouto said amidst 𝗵𝗲's rambling, not having given up picking up anything at all. 𝗵𝗲 would thankfully remind him again if necessary. Your bed doesn't count. Shouto glared at Izawa, hating the feeling of his cheeks heating up. That was once, when he was 12 and it was cold. I have a date. Both men blinked at him, 𝗵𝗲 lifting his gaze from the clipboard he was reading from. A date, Izawa drawled. Did you ask Tenya? That doesn't count. Your father would only agree if you tried to bond with one of the girls. He was relieved that he had asked Midoriya this morning for a date. He hadn't called it a date when asking Midoriya, instead preferring to call it hanging out. Midoriya probably would have freaked out if he had asked her on a date. No, I asked Lady Midoriya. Izawa looked a little surprised. 𝗵𝗲, on the contrary, looked ecstatic. Shouto was aware that Midoriya was one of 𝗵𝗲's favorites to win. He couldn't quite blame him, as he was enjoying Midoriya's company a lot. She was witty, chatty, and didn't mind getting down and dirty if necessary. She wouldn't turn up her nose at the idea of going hiking or traveling on horseback through the wood. If Shouto would ever get the freedom to do that. What kind of date are you going on? 𝗵𝗲 asked excitedly. Something romantic. He didn't think that dance classes were particularly romantic. He wasn't fond of dancing, and he had been told he wasn't the best teacher, so having to teach Midoriya how to dance would be an effort. But an effort worth it, as he would spend the majority of his morning, and maybe a part of his afternoon, in the presence of Midoriya instead of having to deal with a bunch of snobby guests that would chit-chat about absolutely nothing. She wanted to learn how to dance, for the ball. 𝗵𝗲's eyes were twinkling. That's sweet. Do you think she suspects anything about the test? Unlikely. Izawa shook his head. She is clever, but this didn't pop in out of nowhere. The winter ball is tradition, so the girls won't see it as another elimination round. Shouto hated that after the ball, they had to send people home. Well, he didn't hate the fact that the contest was coming to a close. It would mean, however, that he had to send some of Midoriya's friends home. He would never be able to keep all 5 of them here, not if there would only be 8 to remain. I'll tell your father you're on a date, finally, 𝗵𝗲 said, noting something down on the piece of paper. But if he doesn't ask, I won't mention Lady Midoriya's name. She doesn't have the king's favor like some others. Shouto nodded gratefully. His father, the king, was unaware of the entire situation. He just knew about the contest, and that Shouto was mingling with the girls. His father didn't know that he hadn't introduced himself as their future husband and the prince, but just as the prince's replacement. And surprisingly, everyone played along, even the rest of his family. So it was unlikely that the girls would ever find out he was the prince until the last moment. It offered him some peace of mind, knowing that the people interacted genuinely with him and not in the way they should interact with a prince, their future husband. Izuku had opted to wear the flowiest dress he could find, not because he was dressing to impress. The red coloring didn't suit him all that well, but because he needed a dress with some volume. Mina had told him she would go with a traditional ball gown, which meant that it was floor length and 𝗵𝘃𝗲. The floor length would mean one thing: he probably would trip over the skirt, unless he wore heels so that the dress wasn't quite touching the floor. So paired with the dress was a pair of small heels he borrowed from Momo, who was the only one who had heels in his size. Izuku had arrived on time, but Shouto was nowhere in sight. It was 5 minutes later when Shouto arrived. Shouto looked ruffled, hair a little messy and his face red with extortion. Not that Izuku was paying much attention to Shouto's face. He was more focused on the hair that was pulled together in a high, really messy bun. The loose strands framed his face and were being tucked behind his ears constantly. This guy had no right to look so pretty, especially with 2 different hair colors. "Hey," Izuku greeted, waving awkwardly as Shouto came to a standstill. "I'm late, I know. Blame Izawa." Shouto was panting, hands resting on his knees as he was trying to regain his breath. The idea seemed odd to him, but he supposed that the staff members of the palace didn't do a lot of physical labor. Yes, they had to move around the palace a lot, but they could walk at an easy pace, and often they didn't carry more than a small pile of laundry or some files. They didn't carry around timber or had to help people move around furniture when they moved to another home. "It's fine. Are you still up for, Izuku made a vague hand gesture as if that explained what he tried to convey. They literally had the conversation this morning, and yet Izuku had forgotten how to talk. Shouto nodded, and they entered the room Shouto had directed him to. It was a pretty large room, with a marble floor, mirror-lined walls, and a big bay window that led to a balcony. Izuku only had read about ballrooms, but this surpassed his imagination. It was a little overwhelming. "It's huge," Izuku whispered, afraid that his voice would echo in the vast space. "Is this where the ball will be held?" "No, this is for private use. The ballroom is even bigger." Izuku was mentally preparing himself to not cry once he stepped into the real ballroom. He wasn't used to huge rooms. Big spaces were a different story, as he grew up next to a vast forest and vast fields. But when it came to homes, he had lived in a small one his entire life. The small spaces brought him a certain kind of comfort, knowing that you could see every inch of the room. They entered the ballroom, Izuku's heels clacking against the marble floor. "Have you ever danced before?" Shouto asked, cutting straight to the chase. Izuku shook his head. Shouto didn't show any sign of annoyance, but Izuku was convinced that Shouto wasn't happy about it. He had to teach Izuku everything from scratch. And it wasn't like Izuku was known for having a great sense of balance and had good footwork. It turned out that Izuku had misjudged Shouto. He was ever so patient with Izuku, showing him the basic ropes of ballroom dancing. There was a lot of history and theory behind the different styles of ballroom dances, all of them which Shouto talked about as if he had studied them. He probably had, though Izuku wondered why he had an interest in ballroom dances. Shouto didn't look all that passionate about the subject. On the other hand, seeing that Shouto was close to the prince, he had to attend many balls at the prince's side. "Okay, don't get spooked," Shouto said, and then he was crowding in Izuku's space. A hand was placed on his waist, and Shouto tucked his other behind his own back. "Can you sing?" Shouto asked. Izuku blinked, surprised by the question. Not really. Not really was an understatement. Next to humming, Izuku shouldn't try to pursue a career in singing. Well, maybe he was decent when it came to bar songs, but you didn't need to sing well for those. You had to sell them with enthusiasm. Shouto frowned, before picking up a tune that Izuku vaguely recognized. His humming was soft and gave Izuku a nostalgic feeling. It took him a few seconds to figure out why it sounded familiar. It was a lullaby his mother used to sing for him when he was still young, when the terror of the night kept him awake. Almost shyly, Izuku picked up the tune. A small smile crept on Shouto's lips, the first sign of joy he had shown up until now. Their humming was a bit out of sync, but Izuku found it still pleasant. Maybe because it was something that connected them, something that made them closer. Izuku almost tripped when Shouto pulled him a little closer. With the help of Shouto's grip on his waist, he managed to keep upright. Shouto didn't stop humming, instead opting to convey his reassurance through his eyes. Izuku knew that he was trying, but Shouto's pinched eyebrows made him look a tad angry. Shouto's expression caused him to giggle, making him lose the rhythm of the lullaby. Unlike Izuku, Shouto managed to keep his composure and started to guide Izuku through the ballroom with baby steps. As they stepped around, Shouto swayed a little, making the moves less stale and flowier. Izuku had danced before, during weddings in his village, but those dances were usually loud, a little wild, and there was too much alcohol flowing. It wasn't often that someone got married. After all, ballroom dances were the opposite: less drinking, less craziness and laughter, but there was an elegance to it Izuku was unfamiliar with. After swaying and circling around each other for a while, Shouto seemed to think that it's safe to spin Izuku around. Izuku was obviously caught off guard, but shrieked and giggled in delight as Shouto spun him around until he was swaying on his feet. His dress had flared out, giving him the feeling that he was surrounded by fire with the multicolored layers. He vaguely recalled that this dress belonged to Natsuko, whose hair he had done for her wedding. Why did she ever give him this dress? Struggling to regain his balance, Shouto steadied him by placing 2 hands on Izuku's waist, grounding him. Shouto was smiling softly at him. Eyes that he once considered cold were now twinkling with mirth and warmth. Shouto looked like a different person than the one he met on his first day. Someone will bring lunch soon, Shouto said suddenly, letting go of Izuku's waist. Still out of breath, Izuku only managed to nod. He hadn't realized how hard dancing could be. He always had imagined it to be just dancing. Move around and wing it. Clearly, he had underestimated it. Additionally, his dress would be heavier than this one, and he would have to dance an entire night. Izuku mentally groaned at the idea. He would be sore after the ball. There was a gentle tapping on the door, the noise echoing through the mostly empty ballroom. A maid entered the room, carrying a tray with sandwiches. Izuku had expected something different, mostly because Shouto, while a servant, was important. Important enough that sandwiches seem way too simple, especially since Shouto most likely spent many of his breakfasts, lunches and dinners sharing the table with the royal family. Assuming that they were indeed that close, Shouto nudged his side. You're muttering, he pointed out. Oh, Izuku felt his cheeks grow hot. The maid stared at him with curiosity, and Izuku couldn't help but wanting to hide behind Shouto's back. When he met her gaze, she smiled sweetly at him. You're enjoying yourselves, Shouto, Lady Midoriya, the maid asked politely, placing the tray on a single chair. Shouto nodded politely. Yes, Izuku answered. He considered it rude not to answer her. Instead of just stopping at the yes, Izuku just had to let his mouth run. It's fun, though exhausting. To make matters worse, he yawned. The maid was smiling as she addressed Izuku, completely ignoring Shouto's presence. It's nice to see someone use this ballroom again. It hasn't seen much use over the decades, as nobody here seems to enjoy dancing. Shouto straight up glared at her, but she seemed unbothered. Izuku thought it was a little risky, as Shouto was still an important person within these palace walls. He wasn't the prince, of course, but Izuku thought it was a little risky nonetheless. When Shouto didn't answer, the maid wished them goodbye, leaving with a curt bow and a spring in her step. Realizing that he was famished, Izuku helped himself to the sandwiches. He knew that he looked unladylike, stuffing himself with food, but he was hungry, and he wasn't necessarily trying to win any favors with Shouto. He had no desire to marry a guy he never met, and he wasn't sure if Shouto was interested in the real him. Not that Shouto would ever completely meet the real him. Thankfully, Shouto didn't comment on Izuku's table manners, instead choosing to help himself to the food. They finished lunch in silence. Once finished, Izuku started to clean up. He knew that technically, it was the job of the staff, but Izuku had been taught from a young age to clean up after his own mess. You know that the staff can clean it? Shouto asked. He looked genuinely puzzled. I know, but I feel bad for leaving a mess. Izuku wrapped the untouched sandwiches in a paper towel, hoping to preserve them. It has always been my mom and me. And as she works, I'm the one who does most chores. Cleaning up isn't all bad. Shouto didn't look like he was buying it, but he didn't call Izuku out on his oddness. Well, it probably was something odd for Shouto. This was all Izuku knew. We've been making a lot of progress, Shouto said, completely changing the subject. Izuku welcomed it. You want to try again? The ball is in 2 days, and there is a lot to improve. Izuku tried to muster his best glare. He had tried, okay. Shouto didn't have to imply he was bad. He knew that already. However, he was just going to try to get better and blow Shouto's socks off. Sure, I haven't anything else planned. To his surprise, Shouto looked excited. He had felt most of the time that this was a chore for Shouto, so seeing that Shouto was actually enjoying himself was surprising. Not that Izuku minded. Now he felt a little less bad about hogging Shouto's time and attention. You want to try again? They stopped somewhere mid-afternoon. Izuku was exhausted and sweaty. His face felt hot. Sweat was rolling down his face, and the dress was clinging to him like a second skin. His only solace was that Shouto looked as flustered as Izuku felt. You should get changed, Shouto suggested as they exited the ballroom. A maid had brought them fluffy towels to clean up a bit, but it wasn't enough. Before dinner, pushing his curls out of his face, Izuku cringed at the dampness of them. Why was dancing more exhausting than wood chopping? I think I need a bath. I don't think changing will help much. Izuku wrinkled his nose as he pinched a piece of fabric between his fingers. Sweat. Joy. Shouto nodded a little hesitant, looking lost for words. And you should too, Izuku pointed out. You look like a man who had spent his day working in the summer heat. It's winter, Izuku sighed. Never mind. Just take a bath. See ya, Shouto confirmed, face pulled in discomfort. It was probably too casual for someone who was raised in the palace. He and Shouto parted ways. Izuku headed towards the staff quarters, wanting to ask a maid to draw him a bath. They weren't allowed to do that themselves anymore after the soap incident. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧 had come up with the amazing idea to use a little too much soap when drawing her bath. The result had been hilarious. When Izuku came checking in, after she had changed, of course, he was greeted by bubbles and soap-filled bathroom. The staff had been less thrilled. He was longing so much about having a hot bath he almost walked straight into a pair of ladies. They were dressed to the nines, hair complicated, makeup bringing warm colors to their eyelids and cheeks. Their dresses were as fancy as Izuku's best ones, which was saying a lot. How was that even casual wear? I'm sorry, Izuku apologized, bowing curtly before hurrying past them. Neither of them bothered to hide their disdain for him, their gaze burning the back of his neck. The guests were arriving. He had completely forgotten about it, but today was the first day. One interaction was enough for him to hope that he could avoid the rest. He ended up jinxed himself. When he heard the clacking of heels and high-pitched voice he wasn't familiar with, Izuku did what every slightly frightened person did. He hid behind a support pillar in the middle of a grand room. The ladies thankfully didn't notice him, passing him, and they stopped, too curious for his own good. Izuku peeked past the pillar. They seemed to be mid-20s, with matching dresses. They must be siblings because they looked awfully alike. Not quite twins, but between the same blonde hair color, heart-shaped face, and the same big, cheery smile, they were alike enough to be closely related. Did you hear who 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗄's favorites are? The girl in the red dress shook her head, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Who? That brunette girl we just saw. Her siblings looked scandalized. But she's working class. I mean, have you seen her arms? And that isn't even his favorite, according to the rumors. The one in the turquoise dress continued. I've heard that his favorite is someone called Lady Midoriya. Isn't that the green-haired girl the brunette was with? The one with the red dress, now dubbed Red, asked. No, not sure who she is. There was a thoughtful look on the other girl's face. For now, Izuku called her turquoise. No, Lady Midoriya is recognizable. According to the gossip, she is working class, a lot of manual labor. She has those big, green curls and a heavy tan. I haven't seen her, but I don't get why she is still here. To Izuku's surprise, Red managed to say something that was neither a question or something rude. 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗄 used to be a commoner himself, remember, she pointed out. So it isn't odd that he favors the commoners themselves. It also makes the competition seem fairer. Like Izuku, Turquoise looked surprised with Red's answer. How does it make it look fair? Because while in the end someone of a higher class is always chosen, the working class do have a chance, an opportunity to try. They rarely get picked in the end, but they're included. It has been a while this many people from the working class are still in the competition. How do you even know this? Red grew flustered. Mama told us, remember? Apparently, I do pay attention, unlike you. The two started to bicker and finally walked away. Only when they left the space, Izuku dared to move again. Are you okay? A voice asked, sweet and gentle. Izuku looked over his shoulder, seeing nobody else but the princess standing there in all her glory. Princess Fumi was wearing a pink dress. Her mostly white hair was put up in a complicated bun, the few streaks of red standing out brightly. Princess, Izuku squeaked, bowing hurriedly. Hello. Princess Fumi laughed, her turquoise eyes twinkling with mirth. I didn't mean to frighten you. I was just on my way to the library. Izuku waited for the moment she would ask why he was hiding behind a pillar, but she kept on smiling politely. Seconds away from excusing himself, she spoke up. Her voice was still kind but sounded different, more genuine. It wasn't the princess voice she previously used, which was kind, gentle, but also distant. I apologize for them, she said, bowing deeply. Their behavior is uncalled for. Izuku stared at the princess in surprise, till finally, his brain kicked into gear. You're the princess. You don't have to apologize to me. I knew that it would eventually happen. What do you mean? The princess asked sharply. Izuku tried to smile, but he knew that it was forced. They aren't wrong. Commoners rarely win these kinds of things. We're just here to please the general crowd and strengthen the relationship between the commoners and the royal family. To his surprise, Fumi wasn't defending her family. Instead, she just sighed deeply, eyes growing a little sad. The contest is quite unfair, yes. It took Izuku a few seconds to realize what the princess was talking about. Of course, she was older than Prince Todoroki. She was, on paper, the actual heir. The crown belonged to her, but her youngest brother got the crown. Not her younger brother, but her youngest brother, the youngest kid. Amongst most commoners, it was common that the oldest child would inherit the family business if they wanted, though somehow he doubted that any of the Todoroki siblings wanted to become king or queen. It seemed like such an isolated life. The oldest kid that inherited stuff, if they wanted, of course. He doubted any of the Todoroki siblings wanted to become king or queen. It seemed to be such a lonely job. However, the woman's eyes started to sparkle. I know that you're a favorite for a reason. Maybe. The last word was sighed wistfully. Only now Izuku realized that he was talking with the princess and he looked like a wet dog. He was still sweaty from dancing. By now he must be reeking, and his hair was a disaster. This was the first time he talked with Princess Fumi, and he looked like this. Can I excuse myself? Izuku asked, trying not to tug on his hair as it would only bring attention to it. I need a bath. Princess Fumi nodded. You're allowed to go whenever you want. There are no real obligations, aside from basic manners and following the rules. You don't have to entertain me out of politeness. Izuku swallowed, still fearing for the fury which would never come, and then fled the scene with a hurried bye. He was ready to get in the bath and not leaving it till dinner was around the corner. At dinner, Izuku wasn't in the risk of being caught doing something embarrassing, like snooping on rich folk and looking like a disaster in front of the princess. It turned out that none of the contestants liked the increase of chaos in the palace. The gossip circulation has been running overtime, which meant that Mina had grown a vast network of information about all the royals attending the ball. Yesterday, after dinner, the contestants had been ambushed by a group of curious ladies. Izuku knew that the questions were asked out of curiosity, often without malice, but it somehow felt like an interrogation. How are you doing? Do you see yourself become queen? Have you met the prince? Do you think he's charming? Those were the more genuine questions. Some of the others had more of those malicious undertones. Are you even fit for this? Do you think that you can win the competition? As a commoner, not that the girls with a wealthier background had a better chance, of course. That's why Izuku had seen Momo being terrorized by two ladies in their mid-30s, discussing what kind of wedding dress she should wear once she would marry Prince Todoroki. The only good part about it was that Momo had looked as comfortable as Izuku had felt. It was as comfortable as sleeping on a stone floor, rather uncomfortable. After that incident, they made a plan of attack. Izuku was amazed to see how a group of people, who weren't all that familiar with each other, came together and made a killer plan. It turned out that most of the girls had explored the palace and had found hidden paths and rooms, and putting them all together created a network of secret corridors and hidden rooms that would give them the option to roam the castle without meeting a soul. Maps were drawn on napkins, and soon after breakfast, Izuku saw the girls scatter and disappear behind the walls, the flutter of their skirts the only indication that they were ever there. Like the rest, Izuku had opted to sneak through the castle while making his way down to the sewing workshop. Mina had mentioned the dress was close to being done. She had told him that the workshop had most of the pieces she needed, which had saved her a lot of time. No need to make lacy bits from scratch. The layers of the skirts were leftovers from another dress and so on. Right now, she needed to see how the dress fitted and what alterations she had to make before tomorrow. With only candlelight to light the way, Izuku walked through a secret passage that should lead him to somewhere close to the sewing workshop. In their time here, they had explored the palace and had found all kind of hidden passageways, Izuku's library discovery being the first of many. But Nejire's directions had been vague when she describes the corridor, and Izuku wasn't the biggest fan of walking in tight spaces that were barely big enough for two people to pass in some places. After descending several stairs, Izuku saw a light bobbing ahead. Another set of stairs later, he saw that 𝗧𝗵𝗃 was trudging up the stairs, a candle held high. Hi, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 greeted, waving at Izuku with her free hand. Mina summoned you. Izuku nodded. You were with her. He knew that the two of them spend a lot of time together, so he wouldn't put it past 𝗧𝗵𝗃 to lounge in the sewing workshop, especially with all the visitors milling around. Any place the visitors weren't allowed to come was like a safe haven for them. To his surprise, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 blushed, shaking her head. Just was going out for a walk, she said, her voice tight with nerves. Izuku hadn't the faintest idea what 𝗧𝗵𝗃 was actually up to, but he decided that he wasn't going to pry. They all had their secrets. Understandable. See you at lunch. Yes, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 shouted. Her voice echoed off the walls. She grew even more flustered and lowered her voice. I mean, yes, see you at lunch. The two of them wished each other goodbye and Izuku continued his descending. After what felt like an eternity, he met a dead end. Well, there was supposed to be somewhere, but at first glance, it looked like a dead end. It was that he had crossed paths with 𝗧𝗵𝗃. Otherwise, he would have feared he was stuck here and had to walk up the stairs again. As he covered every inch of the smooth wall in front of him, he heard a click, and the door opened slowly. Risking it, the workshops were off limits for the visitors. Izuku slipped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. The door blended seamlessly into the wall as if it never had been there. Izuku had to give props to whoever made the palace. The workshop was easy to find. There was a lot of chatter and cussing coming from behind that door, including the occasional ouch that most likely was an exaggeration of the actual pain. Entering the sewing workshop, it didn't take him long to spot Mina. Her curls were really striking, and her workplace was by far the most cluttered. Walking towards her, he saw something hanging from a coat rack. It was a big dress with a full, voluminous skirt. The skirt was a dark green color, though not as dark as the top. The color of the top was almost the same as hair, only a bit warmer. He wasn't sure about the skirt, as the fabric didn't match the top, not only in color but also in texture. Izuku was a little surprised that he actually had some knowledge of that subject. Do you like the color? Mina asked. She must have noticed him staring at the dress. Izuku nodded, ignoring the urge to reach out and touch it. It wasn't finished, and he would be damned if he would ruin the dress. I expected you would. I mean, most of your wardrobe is dark green. The skirt doesn't match, Izuku pointed out. Mina didn't look offended, which Izuku had feared when he had made the remark. After all, Mina was the one who had experience in this field. Remember your red dress? Izuku nodded. I took inspiration from that. Mina ran a hand through the fabric, and Izuku saw the colors shift. The multiple layers had different colors, just different enough to create a flowing effect. Once it's done, you won't see it when you just walk around in it, but if a gentleman decided to spin you around, I think it will look quite pretty. But first, let's see how it fits. The dress can look pretty all at once, but if it doesn't fit, all have been for naught. Mina took the coat rack and ushered Izuku in a small room. There were a bench and a floor-length mirror, but aside from that the room was pretty much bare. Put it on. Mina trusted the dress into his arms. I want to see. She sounded as excited as she looked. Listening to her request, Izuku undressed until he was just in his underwear and tried to put the dress on. Tried, because the bottom was so big that he couldn't quite find the hole in it. Mina had to help. Thankfully, she kept the probing and poking to the minimum, and after 5 minutes Izuku was wearing a dress bigger and prettier than he had ever seen. Mina had him standing in the center of the room and was now circling him, muttering adjustments under her breath. Izuku thought the dress fitted well, but clearly Mina had things to fix. The good thing is that the dress fits well, Mina said, immediately proving Izuku's theory wrong. You can't really tell that you're a boy. Now the question is, do you want sleeves? Right now, the sleeves ended on the far end of his shoulder. It was short enough to give him mobility in his arm. The lack of long sleeves made his arms look bigger and more muscular, but he also liked the freedom the lack of sleeves gave him. Additionally, he would fear that he would burst out of a skin-tight dress. I like the mobility, Izuku admitted, raising his arm before wrinkling his nose. I think I need to shave. Mina giggled. You definitely have to shave. You're lucky that you have little hair growth to begin with. But it's either shave or have long sleeves. Not left with many choices, Izuku decided that he had to shave. He had a razor with him, which he used if his facial hair started to show. He didn't have much facial hair, thankfully, but a girl growing a patchy mustache would look a little suspicious. Okay, no sleeves. That will save me time. I have to shorten your collar. Mina tugged the collar of his top, before managing to shove her entire hand down his back. You've lost some mass, or I made a mistake. Anyway, it's too loose on you. The skirt will match the top in the end, so don't worry about that. You should consider what you're going to wear underneath. Heels, flats. I think that a petticoat will make the skirt look fuller, so we should definitely look into that. Izuku felt panic settle in his throat. Heels? No way that he would be able to wear heels. He would trip and die. Well, if the heels were anything beyond 1 inch, and he had no idea what a petticoat was, it probably wasn't a coat, which left him completely puzzled to what it could be. You will be fine, Mina patted him roughly on the back. I will finish the dress this morning, and otherwise ask someone else to do it. I don't think I can look much longer at the fabric before I go insane. Somehow, Izuku managed to smile, at least a little. It was a meek smile, but it was something. He was going to attend a ball, like something straight out of a fairy tale. And he would be wearing a showstopper dress. Everyone would see him. Maybe he had to dance with Prince Todoroki in disguise for all he knew. And Shouto, what would Shouto think? Would he think that Izuku looked beautiful? Would he dislike Izuku because suddenly he was like the other girls? Well, if that were the case, Shouto wouldn't be worth his time. I was thinking of asking one of the guards as my date, but I wasn't sure who to ask. Mina was talking animatedly, wild arm gestures and a loud voice. I mean, I met some nice guy. But that is the issue, they're just nice. Not someone that makes my heart race, you know. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and uraraka giggled. Tsuyu stared at Mina with softens in her eyes and Izuku couldn't help but sigh almost wistfully. The tension during lunch had been thick, the fun of today's dodging game quickly wearing off. By the sound of it, most of them wanted the ball just to happen, which was the only highlight of this week. It was hard to cut through that tension. Many of them had failed, but Mina was doing an awesome job. I've asked Ojiro, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said, a blush on her cheeks and a bright smile on her lips. He said yes. I was worried he was going to say no. He would be a total fool if he didn't say yes, Mina said. He would be, Tsuyu agreed. You're a wonderful friend. But I'm happy he said yes, uraraka giggle. That means at least one of us has a date. To his own horror, 4 pair of eyes moved to him. I don't have a date. Mina immediately protested. You could ask Shouto. It clearly likes you. Izuku had considered it, but he doubted that Shouto even wanted to go with him if he was allowed. Shouto was the temporary replacement for the prince. He should remain objective throughout the competition. That he was getting close to Izuku was probably a bad thing. It most likely wasn't even allowed, and otherwise could possibly ruin the objectivity he should maintain. You're considering it, uraraka pointed out gleefully. I don't think Shouto is allowed to date the contestants. With his role in the competition, Izuku said, sounding a bit more somber than expected. But you guys went on a date yesterday. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 exclaimed. I don't know what kind of date, you still have to tell me. But I heard that you've spent hours together. Now definitely he had all the attention of his friend. He wouldn't even be surprised if some of the other girls were listening in. I realized I had no idea how to dance, so I asked him if he could teach me how to dance. He wanted an excuse to postpone work, so he asked me if I had time. It took the opportunity to ask if he could teach me how to dance. Uraraka's eyes were sparkling with excitement. And, did he teach you how to dance? He did. There were several squeals of excitement. 𝗬𝗍 was the first one to speak up. I have no idea how to ballroom dance. Me neither, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 said. I haven't even thought about it. What if Ojiro wants to dance tomorrow? I don't know how. She threw Mina a hopeful look. I don't know how to dance either, Mina exclaimed, holding her hands up in defense. Uraraka shrugged hopelessly, showing how far her knowledge extended to ballroom dancing. There wasn't any. Izuku suddenly felt really selfish. He could have asked his friends to join him in Shouto. There wouldn't be anything wrong with that. Being able to dance would make the winter ball a more pleasant experience for everyone because there would be less toe-stepping and they wouldn't embarrass themselves that much. He could teach them, but he was still a novice himself. Shouto had said so. He was elegant enough to not step on people's toes and follow them, if necessary. But teach them. He would need many more hours of experience before even considering it. But maybe Shouto could teach them. I could ask Shouto if he has time this afternoon. Izuku offered tentatively. I think he does a pretty good job at teaching. And he is experienced. And I have a feeling he wouldn't mind skipping out on work. Shouto just entered his personal hell. Lady Midoriya had asked him to teach her a bit more about ballroom dances and had mentioned some of her friends were interested too. He somehow had forgotten about that when he agreed. He just had been happy to avoid work. What he hadn't expected was to see 13 people gathered at the doors of the second ballroom. He recognized Midoriya and her friends. And there were Momo and Kendo, but the rest of the names fled his mind. The only contestant missing was Intelli. The rest was here, looking at him with big eyes. He was quite sure that a few of this lot already knew how to dance, especially Momo and Kendo. Yet they all seemed ecstatic to be there as if this was a new experience for them. Making eye contact with Midoriya, Shouto was surprised by how bashful she looked. She smiled awkwardly at him, a blush dusting her cheeks. She hadn't planned on having that many people tag along. I'm sorry, Midoriya mouthed. Hey Shouto. The girl with the pink curls, Ashido, probably, shouted, excitement oozing from her. Also here for dance practice. It took him a few moments to realize that the question was calculated. She had picked up on his distress. He hadn't really tried to hide it. And tried to make something out of the situation. Shouto took his sweet time thinking of an answering. Partially because he had been taught that rushing in would do more harm than good. But mostly because he had no idea how he could get out of this situation without offending any of the ladies. He would be torn to shreds by someone. This could be Izawa, Kayama, Fumi or his father if he made the contestants hate him. But he wouldn't be able to teach dozen or so girls how to dance. Midoriya alone had been difficult enough, between Midoriya's inexperience and his own lack of social skills. With Lady Midoriya and some friends, Shouto confirmed. There were dance practice plans. He tried to catch Midoriya's gaze. But the girl was looking at the floor. Her ears had grown dark with embarrassment. He felt bad for the girl, as she obviously hadn't intended to make Shouto uncomfortable. To his surprise, it was Lady Kendo that spoke up. Shouto didn't know her all that well, aside from the fact that she was good friends with Momo and a no-nonsense woman. That's why we're here, she said, gesturing to herself, Momo, and two other girls he quite didn't remember the name of, but knew that slept in the same block as the first two. After a bit of digging, he recalled that the girl with long, vibrant green hair was Shizaki, and the one with the black, shoulder-length hair was Kodai. Both were from reasonably well-off families. But he never had met them before. That means there are 5 of us, and 9 students, Momo explained. It's more manageable this way. Shouto felt his stress ease a little, while remembering that Momo and the few others knew how the ballroom dance. He hadn't expected them to offer him a helping hand. Momo took the lead and ushered the gaggle of girls into the ballroom. The only ones left behind were Midoriya and him. The former looked near tears, still avoiding Shouto's gaze. I'm sorry, Izuku blurted. I never intended for everyone to join. Like I told you, I had planned to only take my friends with me. Anyway, when I went looking for you to ask, the group had made plans to all go, and that Momo and a few others would help out. I couldn't really tell them no, nor did I have much time to warn you. And now we're here. The flush on Midoriya's face has deepened, embarrassment as clear as day. Shouto wondered why he was stuck liking guys. It would have been so much easier if it had been girls, because here he was, participating in a contest that had 24 different girls to choose from. Especially since there was this connection with Midoriya he couldn't explain. Maybe because she was unashamedly herself, which was something he wasn't used from potential suitors. Admittedly, most potential suitors knew he was the crown prince, but he had to do with what he had, and that was befriending Midoriya. He would never have the guts to choose her, to take away her freedom, but maybe they could have some kind of future together. Shouto wasn't good at making friends, and he was sure that he could consider Midoriya his friend by now. We could still pair up, Shouto suggested. Midoriya blinked a few times in surprise, causing a few tears to roll down her face. But she didn't bother to wipe them away, maybe didn't even notice them. I actually thought that Momo wants to do one-on-one practice, Midoriya started, and she jumped into an explanation that she thought that Momo was interested in one of the girls. She wasn't going to say any names, and that this was a good opportunity to get closer. Dancing was romantic, after all. Shouto struggled to keep up with the onslaught of information Midoriya was throwing out there, but he didn't have it in him to tell her to shut up. Her face had completely lightened up. Her body language told him that she was way more at ease than she previously had been. It took 10 minutes for someone to come and fetch them. Midoriya's brunette friends, uraraka if Shouto recalled correctly, looked curiously between the two of them. "Are you coming?" Uraraka asked Midoriya. "Mina is wondering if you've snuck off with Shouto." He wasn't sure who was more flustered, he or Midoriya. He had forgotten that for most of them, the relation between him and Midoriya was romantic. Why else would Shouto want to spend time with a girl? He was good friends with Tenya, but he had never imagined dating Tenya, even before Tenya admitted he liked both genders. "We're coming," Izuku squeaked, and before Shouto had any say in it, he was dragged into the noisy ballroom, calloused hands holding his. After an afternoon of dance practice, the 5 of them had gathered in Mina's room. If an onlooker walked in, they must look like a pile of skirts and fabrics that were haphazardly tossed on Mina's back. In reality, it was just 5 exhausting people. Izuku knew that he and Uraraka were the best out of them. They did a lot of heavy labor, which helped with the stamina, and Izuku had spent time practicing yesterday. Still, he felt his eyes drooping and sleep creeping up on him. He was exhausted and tomorrow would only be more tiresome. With the winter ball finally taking place, Momo can be pretty scary, Mina suddenly remarked, causing movements in the pile of limbs and fabrics. She's really passionate about dancing. 𝗳𝗲𝗄𝗃 spoke up next. "It was fun though. We haven't done anything together with the rest." This made it feel less like a competition and more, well, something we're all in together. Izuku managed to make a noise of agreement. Tsuyu and Uraraka both let out similar sounds. Izuku had worried at first that it would be too chaotic, but in the end, it was a lot of fun. After getting the basics down, some of the girls picked it up easier than others. They were spinning each other around the ballroom, giggling in enjoyment. A few of the girls had a musical background, so in the end, they had played some live music. It almost was like a pre-ball. The only somewhat disappointing part had been that he didn't have much private time with Shouto. Maybe it was a good thing, as he still felt guilty about overwhelming Shouto like that, despite that he couldn't do much about it in the first place. "Hey Midoriya." Tsuyu's voice was barely more than a whisper, but the entire group heard her speak up, and they could hear the worry in her voice. "Do you think the ball is some kind of test?" Izuku's first instinct was to say no, but he didn't know. He had purposely ignored that notion, wanting to enjoy the ball without feeling that his every step would be judged. But what if it was judged? Izuku wasn't going to do anything else. He would still be avoiding the guests. Still worry that he would trip over his dress and fall. Changing his behavior would set off all kind of alarm bells, and it wouldn't improve his time there. "You're muttering. Do you think it is?" Uraraka asked, her voice suddenly sharp with alert. "I have no idea. I mean, how should I know? Because you're our residential detective." Mina grabbed his arm, shaking him a little. "We count you to guide us to victory." Izuku hadn't it in him to shake off Mina, so he let her just cling to his arm. The first 2 tests had been obvious because they were completely out of the ordinary. The first test given itself away had been completely unnecessary, as the palace staff surely knew everything important about them. He didn't want to let a criminal join the contest. And the second test, it was way too outlandish. Nobody in their right mind drops 18 girls in the middle of the wood, without any guards and nobody to greet them. It could be, but I really don't know. And on a brighter note, it isn't like we can change anything. It's a ball, we show up, we dance, have fun and show off our dresses. 𝗳𝗲𝗄𝗃's optimism rendered them all quiet. She wasn't wrong. Tomorrow was the ball, they couldn't skip it, and by looking positively at it, they might get an experience of a lifetime. Even as a boy, Izuku had heard the stories about the fairy tale-like balls, where people danced the night away, fell in love and their fairy tale endings came true. "You guys think the prince will show up?" "No way. I think he has deserted his own contest." "I would do too," Izuku admitted. "He has to pick one woman to marry out of 24. No choice beyond that. But he at least could try to get to know us. Now he has to trust every word Shouto utters, and I think Shouto is biased." Izuku stared at Uraraka with confusion. He doubted that Shouto was actually biased. Shouto probably knew Prince Todoroki well and knew what choice to make. And even if he didn't know for sure, there was still the logic of basic elimination. Didn't pass the test. Eliminated. Especially the second test was based on logic and rules. The only girl he spends time with is you. Sometimes it's Momo, but mostly you. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 added her own 2 cents. I heard that Momo and Shouto knew each other before the contest. That the prince knows Momo. Which means he basically only hangs out with you. Which means that he must at least like you. So he wouldn't eliminate you. Which means that you might not be a good fit for the prince. But he keeps you around instead of girls that would make a good match with the prince. Izuku hadn't thought much about it, and it made him wonder if that was actually true. Was the reason he was still there and would stick around for a while longer because Shouto liked him? He never had been interested in marrying the prince, especially as he didn't even know who the prince was. The princess seemed kind enough, but that didn't say anything about the prince's personality. In the end, it didn't matter. Izuku wasn't going to walk away with a newfound love interest, with his prince or princess charming. He knew that, if anyone fell for him, they would fall for him as a girl and not as a boy. Izuku didn't get a lot of time to ponder about it, as sleepiness was overtaking him. The room was warm, the bed was cozy, and Mina was snoozing next to him, curling up against his side while holding his arm hostage. She was almost like a mini heater. He fell asleep listening to 𝗧𝗵𝗃's even breathing and the whispers that were exchanged between Tsuyu and uraraka.